Hi guys, and welcome to Last Light Radio channel. Tonight we step into a world of pale dawns, leather creeks, and wide grasslands that seem to go on forever. You may have seen the cowboy as a fearless legend in a clean hat, riding under a golden sky with almost theatrical confidence. But what was the real life underneath that dust and sunlight? What did your hands feel like after gripping reins all day? Your clothes smell like after weeks on the trail? Your thoughts sound like in the dark before morning? The truth is less glamorous, more tiring, and in many ways far more human. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And while you're here, tell me your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights and let the prairie open around you, cool and colourless in the moments before sunrise, when your blanket holds the last of the night warmth and the ground beneath you feels hard enough to remind you that romance is usually written by people sleeping indoors. You wake before the sun because the work does not care whether you are comfortable. The air is cold enough to bite the inside of your nose. Your back complains first, then your shoulders, then your neck, which seems to have spent the night learning new and exciting forms of stiffness. You lie still for a moment, looking into the grey light, hearing the low shifting of cattle somewhere nearby and the soft clink of tack from horses moving in the dark. Sleep tries to pull you back. The day refuses. You push up from your bedroll and feel dew in the grass. It wets the edge of your trousers and soaks into your socks if you're careless. Nothing is dramatic yet. That is the funny thing. Real cowboy life is built from small discomforts collecting like dust in a boot. A sore knee here, a split knuckle there, a shirt that never quite dries right. You do not begin the day with glory. You begin with stiffness, cold fingers, and a search for coffee. The camp is already stirring. A cook, often the most respected man in camp after the trail boss, has beaten you awake by a good margin. That alone deserves a hymn. You smell wood smoke before you see the fire clearly. Then comes the scent of coffee, dark and bitter mixed with bacon grease, damp canvas, horse sweat, and the earthy smell of trampled grass. It is not a perfume house favourite, but out here it smells like survival. Tin cups clatter softly. Someone coughs. Someone mutters a joke too tired to deserve laughter. Someone else laughs anyway. You shuffle toward the chuck wagon, shoulders rounded against the morning chill. The wagon is not just a vehicle. It is pantry, kitchen, tool chest, medicine cabinet, and emotional support system on wheels. Many cowboys later remembered the cook with more gratitude than they ever gave a boss. It makes sense. A man who controls biscuits controls morale. Out on the trail, that is practically government. Breakfast is plain and heavy, beans are common, bacon, biscuits, maybe dried fruit if fortune has taken a rare interest in your happiness. Coffee is mandatory in spirit even when it is dreadful in quality. It is often boiled strong enough to remove varnish. You drink it anyway. Perhaps especially then. Your stomach warms, your hands warm around the cup. Dawn begins to show itself in strips of pale orange and silver. The sky opens slowly, like it is reluctant to start the day too. You are dressed for use, not display. Wool shirt, tough trousers, boots built for riding and walking, though often kinder at one than the other. Chaps may protect your legs from brush and weather. A broad hat shields you from sun later on, though at this hour it mostly keeps the damp from settling in your hair. Some people imagine every cowboy dressed like a poster. Real clothing is usually patched, sweat-stained, and chosen because it works. Silk cravats do not help much when a steer decides to object to your existence. Your horse waits in the half-light, and the bond between cowboy and horse is less sentimental than the legends suggest, though no less important. A good horse is your partner, your transport, your best chance of managing cattle, and sometimes your only point of patience in a difficult day. You check the animal carefully. Saddle, cinch, bridle, hooves. Leather needs constant attention. A broken strap in the wrong moment can turn inconvenience into disaster. This routine matters. So much of cowboy life depends on routines so ordinary that they barely sound worth mentioning. Yet these little habits hold the whole fragile enterprise together. Many cowboys in the 19th century were young, often in their late teens or 20s, and plenty came to the work with little money and few choices. Some had drifted west after war. Some came from farms. Some were former soldiers. Some were born into communities already skilled with horses and cattle. A large number of cowboys in the American West were black men, Mexican vaqueros, or men of mixed backgrounds. The popular image later narrowed the face of the cowboy, but the actual workforce on the range was more varied than the myth liked to admit. Out here, skill had a way of speaking louder than tidy storytelling. You move toward the herd as the sun finally lifts. The light spreads over the plain and changes everything from steel grey to gold. It would be beautiful if you had leisure to admire it properly. Sometimes you do steal a moment. The grass glows. The horizon looks endless. Larks lift their song into the thin morning air. Then a cow wanders where it should not, and poetry gives way to practical concerns. That is the rhythm of the life. Beauty, nuisance, dust, wonder, annoyance. All before breakfast settles. The herd has its own sound, and once you hear it enough, you learn its moods. Soft lowing can mean calm. Nervous shifting means trouble may be brewing. The swish of tails, the stamp of hooves, the constant rustle of bodies pressing near one another creates a living texture of sound. At times it is strangely soothing. At other times it keeps you alert in a way that never fully leaves your nerves. A cowboy learns to notice small changes quickly. One animal spooked can become 50. 50 can become hundreds. The prairie can turn from quiet to chaos with very little warning. Your work this morning might involve rounding up strays, moving cattle from one grazing area to another, or helping maintain order in a herd destined for market. There were seasons when vast cattle drives pushed herds north toward railroad towns, such as Abilene or Dodge City. In those years after the Civil War, Texas Longhorns, hardy and rangy, became central to the business because they could survive tough conditions and travel far. That is the mainstream fact people usually remember. Less often mentioned is how much of the technique itself drew from older Mexican traditions. The very word vaquero shaped the methods, tools, and riding style that American cowboys used. The image may have become distinctly American in popular memory, but its roots were more layered. You sit the saddle for hours, and the saddle becomes less a seat than a condition of existence. Your thighs ache, your knees hold tension. Your hands grow used to reins and rope in a way that changes the shape of your muscles over time. Even when you dismount, your body carries the rhythm of riding. Dust settles on your sleeves, your face, your teeth. It gets into everything. There is no glamorous way to chew dust, but you do it often enough that it begins to feel like part of the diet. The sun climbs. Warmth replaces chill. Then warmth becomes heat. This is another quiet betrayal of the cowboy legend. The workday contains long stretches of monotony. You watch cattle. You guide cattle. You stop cattle from doing inventive and deeply unnecessary things. You keep formation with other riders. You stay attentive while almost nothing seems to happen. The boredom can be profound, but it is a dangerous boredom, because you must remain ready. A horse can stumble. A calf can break away. A sudden sound can ripple through the herd. Out here, dull minutes are never fully safe. You talk when it helps. Sometimes that means conversation. Sometimes it means singing softly, not for performance but to soothe nervous cattle at night or to keep your own mind company. On cattle drives, night herding often involved low, steady singing or murmuring because abrupt noises could unsettle the animals. Imagine that. One of the most iconic workers in American folklore spending part of the night humming gently into the dark like an exhausted lullaby machine. History has a sense of humour when it wants one. Your social standing is not as grand as later stories make it sound. Cowboys were wage labourers, hired hands, useful men, often skilled men, but still men working for owners whose money, land, and decisions shaped the business. Wages varied by time and place, but many cowboys earned modest pay for punishing labour. The hat looked independent, the paycheck said otherwise. You are closer to a hard-working ranch employee than to a frontier king. There is a lesson in that somewhere, probably one involving capitalism and sore elbows. The land around you feels immense, but it is not empty in the way older myths suggested. Indigenous nations lived across these regions long before cattle empires expanded. Trails crossed contested ground. Ranching spread into places already known, used, and defended by others. The story of the cowboy exists inside a larger history of displacement, conflict, and transformation. Even in a sleepy tale, that truth matters. The open range was never simply waiting for someone in boots to arrive and look meaningful against a sunset. By midday, your shirt clings to your back, sweat dries and returns, your lips go chalky with salt and dust. You eat when you can, often quickly, with little ceremony, a chunk of bread, beans, salt pork, maybe dried apples. Food is fuel, not occasion. Still, hunger sharpens gratitude. Even plain food tastes generous after hours in the saddle. Water matters more than almost anything. A good water source can shape the whole pace of a day. A poor one can haunt it. The cowboy's skill set is broader than roping. You mend gear. You inspect animals. You watch weather. You read ground sign. You notice weak fencing if fencing exists at all. You doctor sick cattle when needed, on ranches. You may brand calves during roundup season. A rough and smoky business with noise, confusion, and the sour smell of singed hair hanging in the air. Some ranch practices were standardized, others varied by region. Historians still argue about how much daily life differed between the famous trail driving years and the more settled ranch routines that followed. The image of one universal cowboy can blur real differences in time, place, and job. There are quirky details too, because real lives always contain them. Some cowboys wore strings tied around their hats not for style, but for practical reasons, such as keeping the hat secure in wind. Others had superstitions about certain horses, storms, or even songs. Trail crews could develop odd camp rituals, private jokes, and nicknames impossible to explain to outsiders. Men who seemed stern by daylight might be fiercely attached to a battered coffee pot, a lucky bandana, or a saddle that should have been retired years earlier. Hard lives do not remove eccentricity. They may actually improve it. As afternoon stretches on, the world can look almost dreamlike with heat. The air shimmers above the grass. Insects buzz near your horse's ears. Leather grows hot under your hands. The smell of sun-baked sage drifts up if you cross dry country. In greener places, you get the rich scent of churned earth and crushed plants. Sometimes the sky is so wide that it feels almost theological, as though someone has removed the ceiling of the world and forgotten to replace it. Then your horse flicks a fly with its tail and reminds you that the universe remains practical. You learn patience because the job forces it into you. Cattle are not impressed by hurry. Horses notice your mood. Other men depend on you being steady. The loudest cowboy is often the least useful. Quiet competence counts more. This is one reason the popular image misses the truth. A real cowboy is not constantly proving toughness in spectacular fashion. More often he is conserving energy, watching carefully, and doing the same necessary thing correctly for the 100th time. Toward evening the heat loosens its grip. Shadows lengthen. The herd settles more easily if the day has gone well. You feel fatigue now as a full-body fact. Your wrists ache. Your lower back pulses dully. The skin behind your knees feels rubbed raw. Even your face is tired, yet there can be a strange satisfaction in it. You have spent the day in motion, in responsibility, in contact with animals and weather and distance. The labour is real. So is the pride. As the light softens, the prairie changes character again. The harsh details blur. Grass heads catch the sunset. The cattle become dark shapes in bronze light. You hear evening birds and the quieter sounds of camp being rebuilt for the night. Somewhere a pan scrapes, somewhere a horse snorts. Smoke rises straight up if the wind is kind. This hour can feel peaceful enough to trick you into forgetting tomorrow morning for at least 2 minutes. But the cowboy life is never fully at rest. Night means more duties. Herds must be watched. Horses must be tended. Gear must be checked. Supper must be eaten while it is hot, or at least while it is pretending to be hot. You sit by the fire with dust on your boots and tiredness in your bones, smelling coffee again, along with beef, wood smoke, and the faint sweet odour of grass cooling under the stars. Sparks lift into the dark. Conversation comes in low waves. Some men speak freely, others guard their words like coins. And there, in that worn circle of light, the reality of the cowboy becomes clearer than any legend. You're not living in a ballad. You're making a living with your body, your judgment, and your endurance. You're part animal handler, part labourer, part rider, part weather watcher, part insomniac with a hat. It is harder, quieter, and more repetitive than the myth. It is also, in its own stubborn way, more interesting. Because when the stories polish life into heroics, they usually sand away the human texture. The truth leaves it in place. So you eat, you stretch your sore hands toward the fire, you listen to the cattle breathe in the dark beyond camp. Above you the stars spread in impossible numbers, cold and clear over a land that feels both beautiful and indifferent. Your blanket will be rough, the ground will be hard, dawn will come early again. That is the bargain, not fame, not glamour. Work, weather, hunger, dust, routine, and occasional moments of stillness so lovely they almost make the whole arrangement seem sensible. Almost, the morning begins with leather in your hands. Not poetry, not glory, leather. It is cool at first, slightly stiff from the night air, and smelling of oil, dust, horse, and old sweat. You stand near a rail, a hitching post, or sometimes just open ground, checking each strap with fingers that have learned not to trust appearances. A saddle can look solid and still hide a cracked latigo. A bridle can seem fine until a worn buckle gives you a nasty little surprise halfway through the day. Out here, small failures have a talent for becoming large problems, usually at the least charming moment possible. So you inspect everything. You lift the saddle blanket and shake out dust, burrs, and bits of grass. You run your hand along the horse's back, feeling for heat, swelling, or tenderness that might mean a sore spot. Then comes the saddle itself, heavy and awkward in a way that reminds you cowboy work begins well before you ever swing into it. You set it down with care, not because you are delicate, but because a poorly placed saddle is an invitation to misery for both you and the horse. The cinch must be snug, but not foolishly tight. The breast collar, if you use one, should sit correctly. The bridle has to lie cleanly, nothing twisted, nothing pinching. This is not dramatic work. It is skilled work. The horse feels your mood through your hands. If you are hurried, the animal knows. If you are rough, the animal knows. If you are tired and pretending otherwise, the animal definitely knows, and may judge you in complete silence. Horses possess a calm and ancient ability to expose nonsense. You can brag to other men. You cannot really brag to a horse. A horse reads your balanced timing and confidence with merciless accuracy. Many 19th century cowboys rode several horses in rotation, especially on long drives or large ranches. These remudas or bands of working horses were essential to the whole operation. A fresh horse meant a better day. A stubborn horse meant character building, which is a very noble phrase for aggravation before noon. The wrangler, who managed the remuda, often had a difficult and underappreciated job, because somebody had to keep track of a shifting crowd of half-interested horses while the rest of the crew focused on cattle. When you mount, you do not float elegantly into the saddle as later films would imply. Sometimes you're graceful. Sometimes your boot catches in exactly the way you hoped it would not. Sometimes the horse shifts at the wrong instant, and you begin the day with a brief negotiation involving dignity. Even experienced riders have clumsy mornings. That is one of the better hidden truths of cowboy life. Competence is real, but so is awkwardness. They live side by side. Once you are up, the horse's warmth comes through the saddle. It is a living warmth, muscular and steady, with power under it. The animal smells of hide, sun, and hay when well fed, though on hard country the scent can be dustier and sharper. You settle your weight, gather the reins, and feel whether the horse is lazy, alert, sour, willing, or mildly offended by the concept of labour. Each mount has a personality. Some are brave, some are clever, some are saints. Some seem to wake each morning with a private vow to create paperwork. Riding itself is a craft, not merely a habit. You sit deep, balance carefully and learn to move with a horse rather than against it. A green rider slaps around in the saddle and tires himself twice over. A seasoned one wastes less motion. That matters over long hours. Your legs communicate. Your hands communicate. Your posture communicates. The horse is not a machine waiting for orders. It is a partner with nerves, memory, and strong opinions. Good cowboys knew this. They might not express it in tender language, but they knew. Then comes the rope. The lariat feels alive in its own way, coiled and heavy, rough against your palm. Rope work takes repetition, timing, and a level of casual skill that only looks easy from the outside. A loop must form cleanly. Your arm must learn the weight of it. Your body must stay balanced while the horse keeps moving, and you must do all this without tangling yourself like an overconfident laundry line. The image of a cowboy lazily twirling a rope all day is charming nonsense. Most roping had purpose. Catch that calf, hold that steer, drag brush, tie something down, fix what keeps trying to become unfixed. The techniques varied by task and region. Some methods came straight from older Spanish and Mexican cattle traditions, refined over generations by vaqueros whose horsemanship deeply influenced the American West. Bits, saddles, spurs, and riding styles all bore that inheritance. Even words on the range carried it. Rodeo, bronco, lasso, buckaroo. Language itself kept the history riding alongside you, even when popular memory later acted as though the cowboy had invented himself from scratch one windy afternoon. Your hands tell the story of the job better than almost anything else. The palms toughen, fingers get nicked and scarred, nails split. Rope burn can stripe the skin with a nasty heat that lingers. Leather reins leave grime in the creases of your knuckles. Grease from tack gets under the nails. There is no clean version of this work. A neat cowboy is either brand new, unusually fortunate, or heading to town. Routine governs more of the day than outsiders expect. Feed horses, water horses, check shoes, muck a corral, mend a gate, repair a broken strap, sort animals, move animals, count animals again because apparently cattle enjoy arithmetic sabotage. On ranches, much of cowboy labour had less to do with adventure than maintenance. You fix the world in little pieces so the larger business does not collapse into expensive chaos. It is almost domestic in a rugged sort of way. You're forever sweeping disorder back into place. That includes your own equipment. Saddles need oiling, stirrups wear down, cinches fray, bedrolls need tying properly, spurs go missing, knives dull, slickers dry stiff if left badly. A man careless with his gear is often careless elsewhere, and range work punishes that habit quickly. There is a plain honesty in objects out here. A useful thing either works or it does not. Nobody on the prairie is impressed by decorative foolishness for very long. This is one reason many cowboys prize practical possessions with almost ceremonial seriousness. A well-made saddle could matter as much as furniture, transport, and shelter put together. Some men customized theirs with stamps or silver details if they had money, though many got by with functional worn gear that bore years of sweat and weather, a favourite saddle moulded to the rider over time. It fit his body, his habits, his horsework. To lose one was not merely inconvenient, it could feel strangely personal. The ranch itself, if you're working from one rather than pushing a trail herd, has its own rhythms and geography. Corrals smell of manure, dust, trampled hay, and sun-heated wood. Barns hold the thick scent of leather, feed, horses, and old timber. Windmills groan, chickens fuss if the place keeps chickens. Dogs loiter with the moral confidence of creatures who believe they are in charge. Somewhere a bucket rings against a well curb. Somewhere someone is hammering. The work makes a whole orchestra of useful noises. You learn knots because everything needs tying sooner or later. Reins, loads, gates, bedrolls, tarps, restless animals, bundles of supplies. A bad knot is an insult disguised as optimism. A good knot saves time and temper. Rope handling was such a basic part of the life that many cowboys probably stopped thinking of it as skill and started treating it as instinct. But instinct usually turns out to be memory that is practiced until it became quiet. There were little habits too, passed from hand to hand without much ceremony, Hang tack where it can dry. Never leave a gate the wrong way. Keep your knife where your hand finds it in the dark. Do not let a horse crowd you when feeding. Shake out your boots before putting them on, unless you enjoy surprises with too many legs. Some old-timers swore by odd remedies for saddle sores, sprains, or horse ailments. Grease, onions, tobacco, vinegar, ashes, soap, whiskey. Not always insensible combinations. Frontier medicine could be inventive in the same way storms are inventive. Historians still debate how much daily cowboy practice differed from ranch to ranch, especially as railroads, fencing, and regional economies changed the work. The cowboy of South Texas in one decade might live quite differently from a rider in Wyoming or Montana in another. Climate, cattle breed, land ownership, and season all shaped routine. The single popular image of the cowboy flattens these differences into one leather-coloured blur. Real life was more local than legend cared to admit. The pace of learning could be brutal. A young hand might arrive imagining speed, danger, and admiration. Instead, he found chores, corrections, and embarrassment. Older cowboys were not always patient teachers, though many knew a green worker had to be shaped carefully if he was going to become useful, instead of merely enthusiastic. Some lessons were spoken, others arrived by failure, cinch not checked properly. You remember that. Rope coiled carelessly. You remember that too. Nothing instructs like public inconvenience. Even mounting and dismounting became part of a larger discipline. Get off carelessly 20 times a day, and by evening your legs complain like a committee. Swing back into the saddle badly and you can twist, slip, or irritate a horse already unimpressed by you. Efficiency matters because repetition rules the job. The same motion done well saves energy. Done badly, it steals it all day long. By afternoon, the dust on your clothes carries the smell of horse and sun. Your sleeves are marked with sweat and the faint dark streaks left by tack. The inside of your hat band is damp. Your thighs feel the constant work of riding. Even when the task seems minor, the body keeps count. Opening and closing gates from horseback, bending for a dropped rope, turning a quick horse, leaning into a pull, lifting feed sacks, dragging poles, stooping at a trough, crouching to inspect a hoof. The life is full of motions that look ordinary right up until you do them for 10 hours. There is also boredom, but of a specific useful kind. Repetitive labour gives your thoughts long, empty roads to travel. You notice weather by smell before you see it. Dry dust can become metallic when rain threatens. Heat sits differently on the skin when wind shifts. Horses prick their ears toward things you have not yet heard. Ranch dogs go strangely silent. These small observations become part of your intelligence. You're learning the place with your nerves as much as your mind. Some cowboys carried themselves with a plain reserve that outsiders read as mystery. Often it was simply fatigue mixed with caution. Talking less leaves energy for work. It also keeps you from sounding foolish in front of men who have seen more than you. But humour survived everywhere. Dry teasing, nicknames, impossible stories, mock complaints about horses, cooks, bosses, weather, and boots. A camp without jokes would have become unbearable. Gentle sarcasm was a survival skill, really. Not official, perhaps, but spiritually necessary. There are fringe tales, too. The kind that drift around bunkhouses and fires after long days. A horse that sensed a storm 2 hours early. A rider who claimed he could judge a steer's bad temper by the look of its left ear. A saddle said to throw every third owner. Ranchers collected these little legends the way old coats collect burrs. True or not, they filled the quiet spaces of labour. Human beings have always preferred a little folklore with their exhaustion. The discipline of the work slowly changes you. Not into a myth, into a steadier person. If the life suits you, you begin to move more deliberately. You stop wasting effort. You notice details. You respect tools. You understand that competence usually looks unremarkable from a distance. It is built in repeated acts done correctly when nobody is applauding. Tighten the cinch, coil the rope, check the hoof, mend the strap, shut the gate, do it again tomorrow. By the time evening light softens the hard edges of the ranch, the gear in your hands feels warmer, smoother, more familiar. Leather has taken on the heat of the day. Metal smells faintly of rust and touch. The horses lower their heads to feed or stand with one hind leg relaxed, breathing slow. A fly buzzes lazily. Boards creak as the air cools. Somewhere nearby a bucket splashes, and the sound is oddly satisfying, as though the whole place is finally exhaling. You rub down a horse or hang tack where it belongs. Your fingers are tired, but they know the work now without ceremony. That may be the truest thing about real cowboy life. So much of it happens in quiet competence, in the handling of ordinary things with practiced care. The legends gave you gun smoke and drama. The day gives you buckles, reins, rope coils, sweat marks, and the steady trust between rider and horse. And honestly, that version has more substance. Because in the end, the cowboy is not made by posing against the horizon. He is made by chores, by repetition, by the feel of worn leather before sunrise and the small satisfaction of gear put right at dusk. The hat may catch the eye, the horse may hold the romance, but the routine is what keeps the whole world standing. By the time a cattle drive truly begins, you stop thinking of distance as something measured on paper. It becomes a feeling in the body. A trail herd stretches ahead of you like a moving weather system, slow and heavy and endlessly particular. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of longhorns drift over the grass in a restless bony tide, their horns tilting at all angles like a forest made of impatience. The dust starts early, it lifts from the hooves in pale brown sheets and hangs in the air until it finds your face, your shirt, your eyelashes, and the back of your throat. Before the sun reaches its full strength, you already taste the land. This is the part many people imagine as pure adventure. They are only half right. A long cattle drive has grandeur in it. Certainly. The open country can feel vast enough to silence every petty thought you have ever carried. At dawn, the grass glows silver with dew. By evening, the western sky burns copper and rose behind the horns of the herd. Rivers flash in the distance like strips of fallen sky. You ride through landscapes so wide they seem to erase the edges of the world. It can feel almost holy. Then a steer wanders sideways for no useful reason, and holiness gets postponed. The work of moving cattle over long distances is less a grand charge than a patient negotiation with stubborn animals, weather, terrain, and time. During the great trail driving decades after the Civil War, cattle were pushed north from Texas toward railheads where they could be shipped east. The business made practical sense. Texas cattle were plentiful and relatively cheap, while demand and prices were higher farther north. Put simply, people realized that if you could walk beef across half a continent, there was money in it. This was entrepreneurial vision with more dust. You ride in a loose system shaped by the herd and the trail boss. Men take different positions. Some ride at the point near the front, helping guide direction. Others stay on the flanks, holding the herd together and discouraging any bright ideas involving escape. Drag riders take the rear, which is a deeply educational assignment if your education involves swallowing dust until your soul feels powdered. The herd itself decides the pace more often than any man would like. Push cattle too hard and they lose condition, grow restless, or simply become troublesome in ways no one enjoys. A typical day on the trail begins early and settles into long hours of movement. The cattle may cover 10 to 15 miles in a good day, though conditions can shorten or lengthen that. The drive advances with a strange combination of monotony and tension. For hours, very little seems to happen. Hooves thud, grass tears under hungry mouths, saddles creak. Someone calls quietly to a stray animal. Birds rise from the prairie. Then suddenly something does happen, and every nerve in your body wakes at once. You learn the moods of the herd almost as if it were one giant animal. Calm herds move with a certain soft rhythm. The lowing is steady, heads stay mostly forward. The line holds. Nervous herds shift like a thought changing direction. A few cattle begin to crowd. Others toss their heads. The sound thickens. You notice it first in your stomach, then in your ears. The whole mass seems to gather itself around some private alarm you have not yet heard. The trail has its own geography of discomfort. Grasslands may look forgiving from a distance, but a day in the saddle teaches otherwise. There are gullies hidden by growth, hard ground that jars your spine, soft ground that drags at hooves, thorny brush that rakes your legs, streams that seem shallow until your horse steps into a hole, sun that presses down by noon with a flat, relentless force. The heat carries the smell of dust, crushed sage, and animal hide. Sweat dries to salt at your collar. Your lips crack a little. Your shoulders remain tight from holding attention hour after hour. And still you go on. The long drive is not rush drama. It is endurance. Meals on the trail are fitted around movement rather than comfort. You may eat quickly in the morning while the herd is quiet, or grab food at midday when a stop allows it. Beans, bacon, biscuits, coffee, dried fruit if fortune is smiling. Sometimes you chew in the saddle. Sometimes you realize you're chewing only because your jaw is moving and food has appeared there through habit. Hunger makes plain meals feel honest. You do not ask much from lunch out here. Edibility is already a kind of elegance. There is order in the crew, though not always elegance. The trail boss carries authority. The cook carries emotional power. The wrangler manages the remuda and becomes a vital figure because the whole enterprise depends on usable horses. A drive can require dozens of mounts for the men to rotate through. Fresh horses matter. An exhausted horse can turn a manageable day into a miserable one. A bad-tempered horse can make a simple task look like a moral trial. Not every cowboy on a drive is the same, and the group is more mixed than later stories like to show. Black cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, white southerners, white northerners, immigrants, and men of several backgrounds worked these trails. Skills crossed cultural lines even when prejudice remained stubborn. A good hand was valuable. A good roper, a steady rider, or a calm night guard earned respect that could outweigh a surprising amount of foolishness, though not always enough to erase it. The West had practical habits, but it never became magically fair. The herd moves most smoothly when handled with restraint. Shouting is used, but constant noise is not the ideal. Good trailmen understand that cattle are easily upset by confusion. Too much pressure from riders can create the very panic they hope to prevent. There is a patience to the work that does not fit the hot-blooded image of the cowboy in popular fiction. Real skill often looks quiet. You angle your horse carefully. You block a break without making a scene. You guide rather than attack. It is less heroic in posters. It is much more useful on a live animal weighing over 1,000 pounds. Hours pass under an unkind sun. The drive becomes almost hypnotic. Horns nod, tails swish, dust drifts. Somewhere nearby a rider coughs, leather rubs against wool, flies gather and retreat. Your horse sweats beneath you, warm and steady. The rhythm enters your bones until you feel you have always been moving at this speed, behind this herd, across this endless country. Even your thoughts become trail thoughts. Water, direction, distance, weather, behavior, food, rest, repeat. Then there are the little absurdities that make the whole enterprise feel strangely human. One steer develops a determined hatred of the correct direction. Another decides a bush is terrifying. A horse sneezes on your sleeve. A rider invents a nickname for a particularly contrary animal, and by evening the entire crew is referring to it like a troublesome relative. Humour does not stop the labour, but it changes the flavour of it. Without jokes, the trail would feel twice as long and 3 times as dusty. There are scholarly arguments about how romanticised the great cattle drives later became, especially in memory and entertainment. Some historians point out that the years of truly massive long drives were relatively brief, compared with the longer history of ranch work. Others debate how central the trail era should be to the cowboy legend as a whole. That uncertainty matters because the popular imagination sometimes grabs one vivid slice of history and stretches it over everything. The open trail was real and important, but it was not the only form cowboy life took. Still, when you are on it, the trail feels like a world entire. Afternoons can test a man's patience more than mornings. The sun is high, the cattle are tired, the riders are tired. Everything smells stronger now. Warm hide, manure, dust, dry grass, horse sweat. The day loses its freshness and becomes a long, mechanical unfolding of need and irritation. This is when discipline matters, You cannot let your mind drift too far. A wandering rider often creates wandering cattle, and once enough, cattle start to drift. The whole herd can unravel into a broad, most frustrating smear across the landscape. Water crossings bring their own style of dread. A river never looks exactly as you want it to. It is either too muddy, too steep at the bank, too swift, too deep in the middle, or occupied by cattle that have decided this is the moment to become philosophers and question the whole purpose of movement. Getting a herd across water requires skill, nerve, and luck in proportions that vary by day. The smell changes as you approach. Dust gives way to damp soil, reeds, and the cool scent of current. Frogs may sound in the shallows. Insects thicken near the bank. Horses prick their ears. Cattle hesitate. Then someone commits, and the rest may follow, though not necessarily in a civilized manner. You feel the horse gather beneath you as it enters the water. Cold splashes your boots. Mud sucks at hooves. The herd churns around you, horns rocking, heads raised, nostrils flared. The sound is tremendous. Snorting cattle, rushing water, riders calling, tack clattering. All of it combined into one urgent river noise. If the crossing goes well, relief spreads through the crew almost invisibly. If it goes badly, the river can turn the day sour in moments. Night on the trail is its own chapter of labour. The herd beds down if things are calm, but calm is not something you trust blindly. Men take turns on watch, circling or standing near the cattle in darkness that feels large enough to swallow thought. The stars are astonishing out here. They crowd the sky in white layers, cold and exact above the black sweep of land. You might smell coffee from a revived fire, or damp earth if dew settles. The cattle breathe and shift in low, heavy sounds. Horses stamp occasionally or flick their tails at unseen insects. Night guarding is oddly intimate. You are close to the herd, close to your own tiredness, close to every small sound. Many cowboys sang softly during these hours, not for entertainment but to keep the cattle settled. A human voice, low and regular, helped reassure the animals. Imagine the scene properly and the stereotype changes shape. This is not gun smoke and swagger. This is a weary rider murmuring into darkness so 1,000 nervous creatures do not decide to flee under the moon. There were odd beliefs on the trail too. Some men distrusted certain clouds. Some thought a particular kind of silence among insects meant trouble. Others swore that one nervous led steer could spoil the mood of an entire herd. That last one may not even be superstition. Anyone who has spent time around animals knows that anxiety travels quickly, and cattle are not famous for emotional independence. Sleep comes in fragments. You unroll your bed on the ground and feel every hardness beneath the blanket. Boots may stay near at hand for quick use. A slicker can serve as extra cover if the night cools sharply. You smell dust even in rest. Sometimes you dream of emotion because the day has been nothing else. Sometimes you wake confused, hearing cattle as if they were weather. Then you rise again because the drive resumes, and nobody pauses the herd out of sympathy for your relationship with sleep. The great challenge of the trail is not merely danger, it is repetition under pressure. The same tasks, the same vigilance, the same weather-beaten hours day after day, while guiding a living mass of unpredictable animals across a country too large to care about your preferences. That is what makes the work impressive. Not isolated moments of excitement, though those certainly come. It is the ability to keep doing necessary things with steadiness when discomfort becomes ordinary. And yet there are moments when the trail turns beautiful in a way that almost feels unfair. At sunrise, the herd may appear as a dark, flowing shape against pale gold light, each horn tipped with brightness. In cool evening, the dust glows pink and hangs in the air like a veil. Wind passes through the grass with a sound like distant surf. Meadowlarks sing from fence posts where fencing exists at all. Antelope may watch from a ridge, delicate and suspicious. Far off, thunderheads build themselves into cathedrals of shadow and silver. For a minute, perhaps two, you forget sore muscles and bad coffee and the very specific insult of trail dust in your teeth. Then the cattle need something again. That, in truth, is the drive. Not one grand adventure, but 1,000 practical adjustments held together by will, horseflesh, and routine. You ride, watch, correct, wait, move, and endure. You become patient because impatience solves nothing here. You become observant because missing one small sign can cause an hour of trouble. You become humble because the herd is large, the land is larger, and neither one is interested in your vanity. So the miles gather under hoof and boot alike. The days blend into one another, though each has its own weather, its own minor absurdities, its own mood in the herd. Your clothes stiffen with sweat and dust. Your skin darkens under sun and wind. Your body learns the shape of labour so completely that even at rest you feel the sway of the saddle still moving through you. And somewhere in that endless procession of horns, dust, and sky, the real cowboy life reveals itself. Not glamorous, not simple, but real enough to leave a mark on every part of you. By evening, hunger becomes the most persuasive voice in camp. Not refined hunger either. This is the kind that sits in your ribs and makes a tin plate look like a miracle. The cattle have been handled for the day, the horses seen to, the light gone soft over the grass, and now the centre of gravity shifts toward the chuck wagon. If the herd is the reason for the journey, the wagon is the reason men remain civil through it. That may sound like exaggeration. It is not. The chuck wagon arrives in camp like a promise made of wood, canvas, iron, and grease. Its shelves and drawers hold flour, beans, bacon, coffee, dried fruit, sugar, sourdough starter if the cook is skilled and lucky, and enough tools to produce meals under conditions that would make a city kitchen collapse in wounded outrage. The back folds down into a work surface, pots hang, Dutch ovens blackened by fire sit ready. Knives, ladles, sacks of meal, tins, and coffee grounds all find their place within this rolling command post. It smells of smoke, old canvas, spice, hot metal, and the faint sweet note of flour dust. And presiding over it all is the cook, on many drives. The cook is one of the most important men in camp, though not usually because he rides after cattle. He feeds men, manages supplies, brews coffee, keeps the camp organised, and often serves as an unofficial guardian of order. Some cooks were gruff and stingy with praise. Some were surprisingly inventive. Some guarded their sourdough starter like a family secret and their frying pan like a holy relic. A good cook could lift spirits. A bad cook could become the subject of whispered complaints so vivid they practically counted as literature. You approach the wagon with the smell of supper already in the air, beans simmering in a pot, bacon or salt pork giving off its rich, heavy scent, coffee boiling dark and sharp, biscuits baking in a Dutch oven under coals if luck has taken an interest in the camp. Wood smoke threads through everything. So does the smell of men who have been in the saddle since dawn, but nobody likes to mention that too directly while eating. Meals are not elegant. They are essential. Beans appear often enough to feel immortal. Bacon does its part with determined grease. Biscuits can range from soft and golden to objects of theoretical digestibility, depending on the cook's mood and the quality of the flour. Dried apples or peaches sometimes appear in pies or stewed mixtures that taste far better than they sound. There may be gravy, though the term covers a wide territory in camp cookery. Coffee is constant. It may be strong, burnt, or both. Yet a tin cup of it in cool evening air can feel like civilization holding on by sheer stubbornness. You sit on the ground, on an upturned bucket, on a rolled blanket, or wherever your body decides it can fold without complaint. Plates are metal, cups are metal, spoons are metal, everything clinks. The food is hot enough to burn your tongue or barely warm depending on how quickly you joined the line. No one makes much ceremony of beginning. Men eat with focus, there is talk, but chewing receives respect. A meal on the trail is more than nutrition, it marks the day. The long movement of cattle has paused, horses breathe easier, the light is lowering. Fire pulls the camp into a smaller world of orange glow and shadow. Beyond that ring of warmth, the prairie opens into darkness. Wind brushes the grass with a dry whisper. Cattle shift and low in the distance. Somewhere a horse shakes its mane, and the tack gives a faint metallic sound. Supper says, for one brief hour, that the work is not actively trying to kill your mood, there is an art to camp arrangement. The wagon is placed with practical thought. Horses may be hobbled, picketed, or held in a remuda nearby. Bedrolls are spread where ground allows. Fires are built small or larger depending on weather, fuel, and caution. On open drives, camps must remain functional rather than picturesque. Yet even a rough camp develops habits. One man likes his bed near the wagon wheel, another chooses higher ground, another claims the same side of the fire as though the entire continent might run short of acceptable dirt. Companionship forms in these repeated arrangements, not the sentimental sort found in polished novels, but the kind built from labour, weather, and continued survival in each other's company. You learn who grumbles before breakfast, who snores, who tells stories well, who never stops adjusting his boots, who can make a horse behave, who laughs too hard at his own jokes, who becomes strangely philosophical after 2 cups of coffee, and who goes quiet once the stars are out. Familiarity on the range is not always affectionate, though it often becomes something sturdier than affection. Cowboy crews were often young, but youth did not prevent weariness, nor did it prevent loneliness. Many men on the trail were far from family, moving through weeks or months of dust, rough food, and uncertain sleep. Around the fire, conversation could drift into homes left behind. Towns remembered, former jobs, old sweethearts, impossible plans, and exaggerated claims about all three. Some stories grew taller every time they were told. A fish caught in Arkansas could become a river monster by Kansas. A difficult horse became a demon. A small payday became a fortune delayed only by fate and poor management. Humour mattered, more than outsiders might guess. A camp with no laughter would have felt colder than the night air. Men teased one another about cooking, riding, singing, hats, boots, snores, luck at cards, and any mistake too minor to wound pride permanently. Gentle sarcasm flourished because it cost nothing and made poor conditions feel slightly less personal. One rider's torn shirt became a topic of public analysis. Another's clumsy dismount was remembered with devotional care. A man who burned his biscuits, lost a spoon, or sat in the wrong place at the wrong time might find his error transformed into camp folklore before the fire died down. Yet there were also long patches of silence, and those mattered too. Not every cowboy wanted to speak once the work stopped. Tired men often prefer the company of sound rather than conversation. Fire popping, coffee poured into cups, the creak of leather as someone shifts position, the low breathing of horses, coyotes calling somewhere far out in the dark, insects clicking in the grass, wind moving through canvas. These sounds fill the spaces where words would only be extra weight. The smell of camp at night is one of the most distinct things about the life. Smoke in your clothes, horse nearby, dust still clinging to skin, a little sweat, bacon grease cooling on pans, coffee grounds, damp earth if dew has started to gather, wool blanket aired by the evening breeze. It is not a polished smell, it is a lived-in one, layered and honest. If someone bottled it and called it frontier evening, sensible people would probably decline, but out there it means shelter, food, and company. The social world of the camp could be surprisingly varied. Black cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, and white riders might work side by side, though equality was hardly guaranteed by proximity. Skill often commanded respect, but prejudice did not vanish simply because the horizon was wide. Some crews were cooperative, others carried tensions. Historians continue to debate exactly how fluid these working relationships were from place to place, because the evidence differs by region, ranch, and decade. What is clear is that the cattle trade relied on a more diverse workforce than later myths preferred to celebrate. After eating, some men clean gear by firelight, others patch clothing, oil leather, or check a sore hand. Small repairs belong naturally to evening, because tomorrow arrives far too early to trust it with unfinished problems. Needles come out. Thread is licked and pushed through cloth. A torn seam gets closed. A boot is inspected. Spurs are set aside. A rope is recoiled. The workday softens, but it does not entirely stop. Cowboy life includes an astonishing number of chores hiding inside other chores. Then there are the cards. Not every camp bothered, and not every cook approved. but cards could appear after supper when the mood and circumstances allowed. A lantern might throw enough light for a few rounds. Bets remained modest unless someone had experienced a recent attack of confidence. A man's expression at cards might become the subject of more study than his work in the saddle. Bluffing under prairie stars has a certain rustic dignity, right until someone loses a week's wages over a hand that should have been folded by any adult with a functioning sense of regret. Music turns up too, though less as a polished performance and more as a useful companion to the dark. A harmonica is portable enough to survive hard travel. A fiddle, if present, changes the whole mood of camp, though hauling one around requires optimism and care. Singing was more common than instruments in many places. Ballads, folk songs, trail songs, fragments of old tunes, hymns remembered imperfectly, funny verses invented on the spot. Voices are not always polished. That is rarely the point. Music gives shape to the night and takes the edge off distance. There is a quirky truth here that suits the life nicely. Many cowboys seem to have eaten sweets whenever they could get them. Dried fruit, pie, preserves, sugar in coffee, molasses, anything that broke the long tyranny of salt, grease, and beans. For men working punishing hours, sweetness was not frivolous. It was consolation with practical uses. A pie from a capable cook could inspire emotional reactions men would deny under oath. Sleep arrangements remain simple. Your bedroll is your territory, and the ground beneath it has very strong opinions, if you choose badly. A stone makes itself known at midnight with astonishing persistence. Blankets carry the smell of sun, dust, and storage. A slicker may serve as extra protection if rain threatens. Hats can shade your face from early light or cover your eyes from sparks. Boots stay close. No one wants to hunt for footwear in dark grass while half awake and already annoyed. The stars become companions of their own. Away from towns, they spill across the sky in impossible numbers, clear enough to make you feel both sheltered and very small. You can trace bright rivers of light overhead, while the fire settles to coals. The prairie at night has a kind of open hush, unlike anything indoors. It is not silence exactly. It is a layered stillness made of insects, animal breath, distant calls, and the soft, persistent movement of air. Your body begins to slow with it. But the camp is never entirely free from duty. Men may be assigned to night guard. Someone must check the herd, circle it, sing softly if cattle grow nervous, and remain awake while others sleep. The shift from fire talk to night watch changes the whole mood. Warm laughter gives way to dark space, saddle creaks, and patient attention. No romantic speech can disguise the fact that much of trail life depends on tired men continuing to be responsible after they have already run out of charm. Still, the companionship forged in camp has its own quiet force. You may not become intimate friends with every man there. Some will irritate you steadily. Some will remain mysterious. Some may talk too much. Some too little. Some only when half asleep. But shared labour creates an understanding hard to fake. Each person in camp knows what the others endured that day because he endured his own version of it too. That knowledge sits under the jokes and silences like another fire, less visible but steady. The cook closes up the wagon with practiced movements. Pans are scraped. Pots are shifted. Supplies are tucked away against weather, theft, and critters with criminal intent. Embers dim. The smell of coffee lingers longest, as though unwilling to surrender the evening. Men stretch out, cough once or twice, pull blankets close, speak a final sentence into the dark or say nothing at all. And there you are, on the prairie with a full stomach, smoke in your clothes, tiredness in every joint, and the soft after sound of camp all around you. This is not the flashy life the dime novels prefer. It is slower and rougher, but it has its own kind of richness. A hot meal after hard work, a shared joke, a tune carried into the dark, a cook who knows how to make biscuits from difficult flour. Companionship measured not in speeches but in presence. The fire sinks lower. The cattle breathe beyond the camp. The stars keep watch over everyone, whether they deserve it or not. And for a little while, that is enough. Some days begin with a sky that looks almost too peaceful to trust. The light comes up softly over the plain, pale and innocent, as if the world has decided to behave itself for once. Your horse breathes little clouds in the cool air. The herd shifts in a low, sleepy mass. Grass whispers under the first breeze. For a brief moment, the land seems calm enough to forgive. Then you notice the wind changing, or the clouds gathering in a line too dark to be friendly. And you remember that nature out here has moods large enough to swallow human plans without even pausing. A cowboy spends much of his life watching the sky. You do not need schooling to learn that lesson. The weather teaches it directly. Heat arrives with force. Cold settles into your hands. Wind pushes dust through every seam of clothing. Rain turns tracks into mud and rivers into arguments. Lightning makes cattle nervous. Thunder can roll across the prairie like a giant dragging furniture through the heavens. You learn to read signs because not reading them is a poor long-term strategy. Storms on the open range have a way of feeling theatrical and personal at the same time. The air goes heavy first. Sometimes it smells metallic, sharp and strange, like wet iron waiting to happen. The horses notice it. Their ears shift. The herd grows uneasy in small ways. Heads lift. The lowing changes pitch. Flies disappear. Birds go quiet. Then the clouds rise higher and darker, swelling into towers that blot out whole sections of sky. Their shadows race over the grass. The horizon seems to retreat from them. And you are out there under it. Not in a sturdy parlour with curtains and tea. Out there. Rain can be a blessing when the heat has been pressing everyone flat. It darkens the dust, cools the air, and lays a wet hand across a burning day. But a storm is never only one thing. Heavy rain soaks your hat brim until water drips from it steadily. Your shirt clings. Your trousers grow heavy. Leather swells and stiffens. The saddle turns slick under you. Mud begins to gather on boots and hooves. Ground that seemed firm an hour earlier becomes treacherous. A horse can slip. A wagon can bog down. A creek can become a river with ambitions. Lightning is worse. It rips open the sky with a violence too quick to understand. For a second, the land goes white and sharp. Every horn in the herd outlined in terrible clarity. Then comes the thunder. Not polite and distant, but crashing over you with a force that seems to strike the ribs from the inside. Cattle hate that kind of surprise. Horses do too, though some hide it better than others. Men are not fond of it either, whatever they claim afterward. This is where calm matters. Real calm, not theatrical bravery. A cowboy facing bad weather does not usually become louder or grander. He becomes deliberate. He stays aware of the herd, the ground, the nearest shelter if any exists, and the mood spreading through animals faster than reason ever could. Panicked cattle are dangerous. Panicked horses are dangerous. A panicked rider merely adds another moving problem to the collection. So you keep your voice steady, you guide where you can, you wait where you must, and you hope the sky's in a passing mood rather than a vindictive one. There were all sorts of beliefs about storms on the range. Some men swore cattle could sense lightning well before it arrived. Others claimed a certain shade of green in the clouds meant real trouble. A few believed thunder during a full moon made animals especially nervous. Historians still argue over how much these weather sayings reflected observation, and how much belonged to the rich old tradition of men sounding wise in uncertain conditions. Probably both. Life on the range produced practical knowledge and dramatic superstition in almost equal measure. Then there are rivers. Rivers are never merely scenery to a cattle crew, that they are obstacles, threats, chances, delays, and occasional insults disguised as water. On a map, a river is a line. In real life, it is a wide-moving decision with mud on both sides. Some crossings are manageable, some are ugly. Some look harmless and then reveal a hidden current that grabs at legs and bellies with far too much confidence. As you approach one, the smell changes before the sight fully does. Dry grass gives way to damp earth, reeds, and the rich green scent of growth along the banks. Insects thicken in the air. Frogs may click or croak from the margins. Mud shows where hooves have sunk before. The horses step differently now, more careful, more interested in the ground. The herd bunches as animals hesitate. Water reflects the sky in broken silver or brown ripples. It can look beautiful in the deeply unhelpful way that dangerous things often do. Crossing a river with cattle requires nerve, timing, and a remarkable amount of persuasion directed at creatures not famous for reasoned group discussion. The lead animals must commit. Once a few go in, others may follow, though not always in the direction you would prefer. Riders work the sides, keeping the herd from spreading too far or breaking apart. Horses enter the current with tense shoulders and lifted heads. Cold water rushes around your boots. Mud tries to pull the world downward. The noise of the crossing is enormous. Splashing, snorting, shouting, tack clattering, hooves scrambling as current pushing. It feels like weather happening at ground level. If the water is swift, the danger grows quickly. Calves can be swept aside. Weaker cattle may lose footing. A rider can find himself pinned against bodies, turned in the saddle, fighting both river and herd at once. And still, the work must go on because stopping halfway through is not a serious option. Some crossings ended with lost animals, broken gear, and men too tired to speak above a mutter. The trail rarely pauses for emotional processing. There is a famous uncertainty in Western history over exactly how often certain river disasters occurred, compared with how often later storytellers embellished them. Memory loves a river scene. It has movement, risk, noise, and heroic possibilities. Scholars debate which recollections were sharpened by truth and which were polished by retelling. But there is no serious question that river crossings were among the most difficult parts of cattle work. Even without drama, they demanded hard skill. Then, of course, there is the word everyone knows, stampede. It sounds almost too neat for what it means. A stampede is not neat. It is fear becoming motion at a scale large enough to terrify the ground itself. One moment the herd is settled, or at least manageable. The next, something startles it. Lightning, a sudden noise, a horse breaking through, a predator scent, a clap of thunder at the wrong instant, a shifting object in darkness. Sometimes nobody is entirely sure what started it, which feels rude after the amount of trouble involved. The first sign may be a nervous ripple. Cattle bunch closer, heads jerk, hooves begin striking faster, the lowing changes into a rougher sound, higher and more urgent. Then the herd breaks into movement, not graceful movement, mass movement, horns, backs, eyes, breath, muscle, dust, terror. The earth shakes under the surge. What was a herd becomes a flood made of panic and bone. At night it is worse. Darkness steals shape from everything, leaving only sound and force. You hear the eruption first, a pounding that builds in a heartbeat from uneasy shifting to full thunder. Men shout, horses lunge awake, bedrolls are abandoned, saddles are grabbed with hands still clumsy from sleep. In those first seconds, confusion is the true enemy. You have to mount fast, find the moving edge of the herd, and work alongside it without getting swallowed. The cowboy method in a stampede is less about stopping the herd outright, and more about bending its motion. If riders can get to the front or side and turn the leaders into a circle, the animals may mill rather than run straight into disaster. It takes speed, horsemanship, courage, and a horse willing to face the edge of mass panic with you. The dust can be blinding. The noise pounds at your chest. Breath comes in hot bursts. Reins are slick in your hands. You feel the horse straining beneath you, muscles bunching and releasing. Every step a negotiation with chaos. This is one of the rare moments when the legend and the reality briefly shake hands. It is dramatic. It is frightening. It is also filthy, exhausting, and far less elegant than painting suggest. A stampede smells of dust, fear, trampled earth, and animal heat. The air itself seems bruised by the movement. If moonlight is out, it flashes on horns and rolling eyes. If rain accompanies the panic, mud flies. If lightning is involved, the whole terrible scene appears in bright pieces, as if the storm is taking cruel little photographs. You shout until your throat burns. Not because shouting is noble, but because human beings make noise when trying to push back against disaster. There were odd tricks and habits tied to stampede control. Some old trail hands believed singing could calm a nervous herd before panic fully took hold. Others swore by keeping certain led steers especially steady. A few riders claimed they could sense trouble minutes early by the way cattle breathed or shifted their tails. That sounds suspiciously mystical until you remember how long experienced people can spend reading animals. Practical wisdom often looks like magic to those without it. The aftermath of a stampede can be nearly as wearing as the event. Once the herd is brought under some control, you may find scattered cattle over a wide area, broken gear, shaken horses, and men running on nerves rather than rest. Dawn after a bad night can feel cruelly ordinary. The sky turns pink. Birds begin as if nothing happened. Your body shakes a little from strain and lost sleep. Dust dries on your face. You taste grit with every swallow. Then the counting begins, and no one enjoys counting after chaos. Storms and stampedes had a way of becoming camp stories for years afterward, though each telling usually improved the teller's instincts and the weather's villainy. One rider was always half a second faster than he probably had been. One horse became nobler in memory. One clap of thunder grew louder with each season. Human beings do this naturally. Surviving danger makes people want a better narrative than pure luck, and sometimes luck had been doing more work than anyone wanted to admit. Still, skill mattered. A steady rider could save cattle and lives. A cool-headed trail boss could keep fear from spreading through the crew. A good horse could carry a man where lesser animals would refuse. Nature might be large and indifferent, but the people working under it were not helpless. They learned, they watched, they adapted. They gathered hard knowledge the way boots gathered mud, one difficult mile at a time. The range had other hazards too. Sudden cold snaps, hail that came down hard enough to sting through clothing, dry seasons that left water scarce and tempers shorter. Prairie fires in some regions could sweep fast under the right conditions, turning grasslands into walls of heat and smoke. The cowboy was never really conquering nature in the grand way later fiction liked to imply. He was negotiating with it daily, usually from a position of limited authority and damp socks. That may be the truest point of all. The great threats of cowboy life were not always gunfights or villains with black hats. Often they were storm clouds, flooded banks, muddy footing, spooked cattle, and the sudden understanding that the land could become dangerous without warning or malice. There is something almost sobering in that. Nature does not hate you. It simply does not arrange itself around your comfort. So you keep riding. You watch the wind in the grass and the colour of distant clouds. You study the riverbank. You listen for unease in the herd. You learn the difference between ordinary restlessness and real fear. You trust your horse, your hands, your judgment, and perhaps one or two superstitions you publicly mock while privately keeping. Because when the storm finally cracks overhead, or the river pulls hard at your stirrups, or the herd breaks into that dreadful pounding run, there is no room for performance, only work, only nerve, only the next right movement made quickly enough to matter, and afterward, when the sky clears, the river lies shining again, or the herd finally settles in a trembling circle under the stars. The range becomes quiet with astonishing speed. Water drips from leather, mud dries on boots, horses blow hard through their nostrils, men speak in lower voices. Somewhere far off, thunder rolls away like a wagon leaving town. The danger passes, the smell of wet grass rises. The land looks innocent again, and you know better now. By the time money reaches your hand, it has usually lost some of its charm. You have imagined wages during the long hours. That is only natural. A man bouncing in a saddle under a hard sun is entitled to fantasies, and many of those fantasies involve coins landing in his palm with a pleasant and respectful weight. But the real arithmetic of cowboy life is less romantic. You work hard, you work long, and the pay often arrives looking modest enough to make you wonder whether the cattle are receiving a better arrangement. The cowboy is not a frontier prince. He is hired labour. That plain fact sits underneath the whole business, no matter how many stories later wrapped it in swagger and sunset. Ranch owners, cattle companies, and trail bosses could make real money if the market behaved, and disease, weather, rustling, or bad luck did not interfere. The men riding the herd earned wages. Useful wages, perhaps, sometimes better than the pay in other rough occupations, but still wages. You sell your time, your strength, your skill with animals, and your willingness to sleep badly in exchange for cash that disappears with surprising speed. During the great cattle years of the late 19th century, many cowboys earned around $30 to $40 a month, though the exact figure changed by place, season, and type of work. Board was often included, which sounds generous until you remember board meant beans, bacon, biscuits, coffee, and the privilege of sleeping on ground with opinions. Some men earned less, a few earned more, especially if they had special responsibilities or strong reputations. But nobody sensible mistook the work for a path to instant comfort. The hat looked independent. The ledger did not. Your expenses waited quietly for that money. Boots wore out, shirts tore, gloves needed replacing. A hat might survive weather for a while, but not forever. Spurs, knives, blankets, slickers, saddle gear, and ropes all had a habit of aging under hard use. If you owned your saddle, it represented a serious investment. If you did not, then somebody else's property was under your care, which came with its own tension. Men in rough jobs rarely stay rich in equipment for long because the work keeps grinding through the objects that make it possible. Then there was town. A cattle town or rail town could empty a month's wages with almost artistic efficiency. Food that tasted different from camp food, a haircut, tobacco, drinks, gambling, new clothes you did not truly need but very much wanted after weeks of dust and grease, perhaps a letter written home on better paper than usual, perhaps a room with an actual bed and the dangerous luxury of walls. This sudden availability of things creates its own kind of weakness. Many a cowboy who had lived like a patient stoic on the trail discovered in town that he was in fact an enthusiast with poor financial boundaries. Some employers paid promptly, others did not. Delays, disputes, deductions, and vague promises were not unknown. A cowboy might finish a stretch of work and find the accounting less generous than hoped. There could be arguments over damaged gear, time lost, advances taken, or terms remembered differently by the man paying and the man receiving. This was not a world built entirely on written fairness. Handshakes mattered, reputations mattered, and both could still leave a worker short. You feel the class truth of the occupation in small ways as well as large ones. Owners make decisions about herds, routes, land, contracts, and expansion. You carry out labour under those decisions. A ranch house, if the ranch has one of consequence, stands very differently from bunkhouses, line shacks, or bedroll camps. The contrast does not need a speech. You can smell it in cleaner rooms, see it in better furniture, hear it in the absence of snoring 6 feet away. The cowboy belongs to the working side of the cattle kingdom. This is where the legend begins to fray. Popular stories often treated cowboys as symbols of fierce independence, men answerable to nobody but weather and their own nerve. The reality is more complicated. You may ride across open country and handle difficult tasks with impressive skill, yet still be taking orders, following schedules, and protecting someone else's investment. There is independence in the daily practice of the job. Yes, a rider far out on a range must make quick decisions alone, but economic independence is another matter on that front. Most cowboys were closer to farmhands, dock workers, or other wage earners than to free-roaming heroes of pure myth. The labour itself was relentless. Long hours were common. Some ranch work became seasonal and cyclical, but even then the tasks piled up. Roundups, branding, fence repair where fences existed, breaking horses, tending sick animals, cutting hay in some operations, watching water sources, moving herds, night riding, storm duty, and all the repairs that appear the moment you imagine resting. The day could start in darkness and end in darkness, with only brief meals interrupting the chain of obligation. If you calculated the hourly rate too carefully, the result could feel insulting, and still men took the work. Why? For some, there were not many better options. The West held people in motion. Veterans of war, drifters, young farm boys, freedmen looking for wages, immigrants seeking work, men who did not fit easily into settled domestic life, and riders raised around stock all found places in cattle labour. The job demanded skill, but it also absorbed those who could endure hardship and learn fast. A man without property might not be able to choose comfort, but he could choose a saddle and a paycheck if the chance appeared. For black cowboys, the work could offer wages and mobility in a society that still pressed hard with racism and exclusion. That did not make ranch life equal or easy. It simply meant that cattle work sometimes opened doors shut elsewhere. Mexican vaqueros and Tejano riders brought vital skills to the cattle industry, though later narratives often stripped them from the center of the story. Indigenous people also worked in ranching economies in some regions under widely different circumstances. The class picture of cowboy life was never simple, because it sat at the meeting point of labor, race, region, and power. Historians still debate how much freedom cowboys genuinely felt, in contrast with how much later literature projected that freedom onto them. The evidence points in both directions because lived experience is rarely tidy. A cowboy could feel richer in sky and motion than a factory worker in a city, yet still remain trapped by low wages and unstable employment. He could enjoy a powerful daily sense of competence while owning very little. He could look free from a distance and feel precarious up close. Both things could be true at once, which is usually how history behaves when it refuses to become a slogan. There were also layers within the work itself. A trail boss held more authority than an ordinary hand. A foreman on a ranch stood above the crew but below ownership. A wrangler had specific responsibilities. A cook, though not always high in formal rank, could rule camp morale like a minor sovereign. Some men moved upward through experience, reputation, and luck. Others drifted from job to job, never quite settling, never quite improving their position. The cowboy world had hierarchy even when everyone wore dust, and pride existed inside that hierarchy. Working men always find ways to measure themselves beyond wages. Horsemanship becomes one measure, reliability another, nerve under pressure, skill with a rope, ability to handle difficult cattle, calm in bad weather. A man may have little money and still guard his reputation fiercely. In some ways, the less wealth a person has, the more closely he may hold the currency of respect. On the range, being known as steady, capable, and uncomplaining could matter enormously, not because it brought luxury, but because it brought trust and future work. That trust did not remove exploitation. It merely made the labor world function. Some ranches were stricter than others. Some bosses were fair. Some were petty, mean, or cheap. A worker might be praised for endurance one day and docked for some disputed matter the next. The cowboy had limited leverage unless he could leave and find work elsewhere, and leaving was easier in strong seasons than in weak ones. Drought, market swings, bad winters, and overstocking could reshape the business quickly. When cattle prices fell or herds suffered losses, labor felt the shock. The worker always meets the downturn with his body first. The bunkhouse, when you slept in one, made class visible too. It smelled of wool, leather, tobacco, sweat, dust, damp socks, and whatever supper still lingered in the boards. Beds might be narrow, blankets rough. Privacy was mostly theoretical. Snoring was democratic in the worst possible way. A bunkhouse gave shelter, but not refinement. Compared with sleeping outside, it could feel splendid. Compared with the owner's house, it remained a plain declaration of social position. Furniture says things without speaking. Then there is the loneliness built into wage labor away from home. A cowboy's money might travel to family through letters, remittances, or delayed visits. But distance had its own cost. The work pulled men into long separations from wives, parents, siblings, and children. Some never settled at all. Others settled later than they expected because the lifestyle kept postponing stability. The myth celebrates mobility. Real life notices what mobility prevents. A man can move constantly and still feel stuck. Quirky stories grew around wages too. There were cowboys who swore they could make a month's pay last through an entire season, which usually meant they were lying, unusually disciplined, or had discovered a town without shops, cards, drink, and temptations of any kind. There were also men who reached payday with magnificent intentions and reached the next sunrise with nothing but a new hat and a face suggesting private regret. Money on the range behaved like water in sand. It arrived visibly and vanished with speed. One underappreciated reality is that the cowboy's class identity shaped his manners. He might look rough, But he often understood work discipline very well. He knew how to follow necessary orders, how to carry his share, how to avoid becoming deadweight in a crew. There was an ethic of contribution behind the image. Men who did not pull their weight became resented quickly. On the range, laziness is not a personality quirk. It is a burden someone else has to carry while tired. This helps explain why many cowboys could appear reserved or skeptical around grand claims. Hard labour teaches people to distrust performance that is not attached to function. A flashy talker who cannot manage a horse remains merely decorative. A quiet rider who can handle trouble becomes valuable. It is a practical class culture, even if later fiction turned it into a theatre of lone masculine display. As the 19th century wore on, larger economic changes squeezed the cowboy world further. Railroads changed routes and markets. Barbed wire closed land that had once been open range. Big cattle operations grew more organized. Some work became more settled, less nomadic. The famous long drive era narrowed. The cowboy remained, but the conditions around him shifted. In that shift, the class truth became even clearer. He was part of an industry, not a wandering knight from a leather-bound dream. Yet the work could still offer something wages do not fully explain. There was the deep satisfaction of competence, the physical clarity of a day spent doing real tasks with visible results, the strange privilege of living outdoors under enormous skies, the companionship of crews that understood hardship without lengthy explanation, the vividness of weather, horses, and land. These things did not erase low pay, but they did help people endure it. Human beings often stay in hard occupations because the job gives them some other form of meaning alongside the money. That does not make the pay fair. It makes the life complicated. By evening, when your body feels spent and your hands smell faintly of leather and rope, class is not an abstract theory. It is in your wages. It is in your sleeping arrangements. It is in who signs the contract and who fulfills it. It is in the difference between managing cattle and owning them. You may carry yourself with pride. You may ride beautifully. You may know weather, horses, and open country better than the man whose name is on the ranch deed, but the deed is still his. That is the quiet core of the matter. The cowboy was real. The skill was real. The hardship was real. So was the romance, sometimes, in the look of evening light over a herd and the feel of a good horse under you. Yet beneath all of it stood a working man making a living the hard way. Paid just enough to come back and do it again. And perhaps that makes the figure more interesting, not less. Because legends are easy, labour is not. On the open range, the word cowboy sounds singular. The reality was never singular at all. When you ride with working men in the cattle world of the 19th century, you do not meet one fixed type repeated across the landscape like fence posts. You meet a mixed company of accents, faces, customs, religions, jokes, skills, and private histories. Some men were born to stockwork. Others arrived by accident, necessity, or sheer stubborn drift. Some had grown up speaking Spanish. Some carried the memory of enslavement. Some came from farms in the South or Midwest. Some were recent immigrants. Some had military pasts. Some wanted freedom. Some wanted wages. Some wanted distance from whatever waited behind them. The popular image later tried very hard to simplify this. It failed. A large number of working cowboys in the American West were black, Mexican, or Mexican-American. That is not a decorative correction added by modern taste. It is a basic part of the actual labour force. After the Civil War, many black men moved into cattle work because ranching and trail driving offered employment, at a time when opportunities elsewhere could be brutally limited. Estimates vary, but historians often suggest that roughly a quarter of cowboys may have been black. The exact number remains debated because records are incomplete and the occupation itself shifted over time and place. But nobody studying the subject seriously can treat black cowboys as a rare curiosity. They were part of the work itself. For Mexican and Tejano riders, the story goes back even further. Long before the United States built its cowboy legend, Spanish and Mexican cattle traditions had already shaped life across northern Mexico, Texas, and the borderlands. Vaqueros developed many of the methods, tools, and riding practices that later became standard in the cattle trade. The saddle styles, rope work, spurs, bits, and even much of the working vocabulary carried this inheritance. A cowboy sitting tall in the saddle often owed more than he realized to generations of horsemanship that came before him. You can hear that history in language. Buckaroo likely grew from vaquero. Lariat came through lariata. Bronco, rodeo, mustang. Chaparreras shortened into chaps. The range spoke in blended terms because the labour world itself was blended. Sometimes history hides best in ordinary words. Men repeat them daily until they seem native to the air, forgetting they arrived by older roads. If you ride with such a crew, the social world becomes more complex than the myth of the lone white frontiersman ever allows. You hear Spanish spoken beside English, perhaps mixed together in practical phrases shaped by work. You notice different habits around food, prayer, manners, and storytelling. One rider may hum a tune learned in Louisiana. Another curses softly in Spanish when a rope tangles. Another keeps quiet about his past until a certain topic brings out fragments of memory. Labour throws people together who might never have shared a room, much less a trail, in more settled places. That does not mean harmony came automatically. Prejudice rode west too. The range did not transform human beings into saints just because the scenery was large. Black cowboys could earn respect for skill and still face racism. Mexican vaqueros could be admired for horsemanship and still be treated as lesser in pay, status, or public memory. Indigenous people might be represented as part of the landscape in popular stories while their actual labour, expertise, and displacement were ignored. The cattle world could be practical about ability and unjust about identity at the same time. Human societies are fully capable of such contradictions, especially when profit is involved. Still, work creates relationships that theory alone cannot explain. A man who can sit a difficult horse, handle cattle cleanly, and stay steady in bad weather becomes valuable to the crew. When your safety depends on another rider's judgment, you tend to notice competence before rhetoric. That did not erase bias, but it shaped the social reality of the range. Respect could grow unevenly, awkwardly, and without ever becoming full equality. A good hand might be indispensable by daylight and excluded by custom after dark. History rarely offers the simplicity either cynics or romantics would prefer. Black cowboys carried lives far more varied than the legend allowed. Some had been enslaved and moved into cattle work after emancipation. Some had learned stock handling while still under bondage because enslaved labour had long supported ranching and farming systems. Others were born free and came west seeking wages or room to breathe. A few became famous in their own day, though many more remained ordinary workers whose names vanished from record while their labour remained everywhere in the economy. Their stories complicate the fantasy of the West as a blank stage for one narrow kind of manhood. You might meet one of these riders in camp and not hear much at first. The range does not always encourage grand self-disclosure, but over time details appear. A scar from army service, a folded letter kept in a shirt, a phrase from childhood, a careful silence whenever family comes up, a particular church hymn sung softly while mending gear. Identity on the range is not always announced. Sometimes it arrives in these smaller signs, stitched into routine. Mexican and Tejano cowboys often carried the deepest technical knowledge in cattle work, particularly in places where ranching traditions ran back into Spanish colonial systems. Their riding could be fluid and exact, their rope handling efficient, their understanding of stock grounded in generations of practice. Many Anglo cowboys learned directly or indirectly from them, yet later popular culture often stripped the vaquero from centre stage and handed his methods to a mythic cowboy who somehow appeared fully formed with a hat and a squint. It is one of history's less elegant acts of borrowing. Indigenous men also participated in ranching and cattle work in different regions, though under circumstances shaped by conquest, removal, labour demand, and survival. Some communities adopted horse culture with remarkable skill and speed. Others interacted with ranching economies as workers, traders, scouts, or opponents depending on time and place. The simplification of Western history into cowboys on one side and native peoples on the other leaves out a much more tangled reality. Lives on the plains and in the borderlands rarely fit clean lines. Then there were immigrants from Europe and elsewhere, some newly arrived, some already a generation into American life, all trying to find footing in a rough economy. A Swedish rider, an Irish hand, a German ranch worker, a French cook, a man from the Caribbean, a freedman from Texas, a vaquero from Coahuila, all might exist within the same broad cattle network. Not every crew was so varied, of course. Local conditions mattered. But the idea that the cowboy world was ethnically simple belongs more to later storytelling than to the historical ground. Historians still debate how much different groups mix socially versus merely worked alongside one another. Evidence suggests both closeness and separation, depending on region, ranch policy, local prejudice, and the personalities involved. Some bunkhouses were integrated in practice, if not in theory. Some were not. Some trail crews cared chiefly about labour and results. Some reproduced the wider society's hierarchy with determined fidelity. The uncertainty remains because the West changed fast, records were uneven, and memory has a terrible habit of polishing away discomfort. Even gender on the edges of the cowboy world was more complex than the standard image suggests. The classic cowboy job was overwhelmingly male, but women in ranching communities performed demanding labour that kept operations going. They managed households, livestock, gardens, accounts, meals, laundry, poultry, dairy work, childcare, and sometimes direct riding and stock work as conditions required. In some regions, women rode, roped, doctored animals, and worked with a confidence later stories pretended belonged only to men. The cowboy image became a masculine icon, but the ranching world around it depended heavily on women whose labour was considered ordinary enough to be overlooked. You also find age diversity, though youth was common. Some riders were barely out of boyhood, thin and eager, trying to harden themselves into usefulness. Others were seasoned men whose bodies already carried years of saddle strain. The older hands often spoke less and watched more. They had seen enough to distrust display. A younger cowboy might still dream of becoming a legend. An older one usually hoped for sound horses, decent weather, a fair boss, and coffee that did not taste like punishment. Religion varied too, sometimes loudly, sometimes not at all. Catholic practices travelled with many Mexican families and communities. Protestant hymns and habits marked many black and white cowboys from the South. Some men prayed openly, others kept faith private. Some were devout in storm weather and quite flexible the rest of the week, which is a common frontier theology. A trail crew could include multiple ideas of God joined by one very practical agreement about breakfast. Food itself hinted at cultural crossing. Beans and coffee may sound universal on the trail, but seasoning, bread styles, meat preparation, and little camp preferences revealed where men had come from. One rider wanted chili if he could get it. Another longed for cornbread. Another talked about molasses as if it had healing properties. The cook could become a diplomat of appetite, balancing what was possible against what men missed from home. Sometimes the result was excellent. Sometimes it was just beans with ambition. The stories men told about themselves also depended on who was listening. Around strangers, a cowboy might flatten his past into something simple. Around trusted company, more detail emerged. A black rider might speak of Reconstruction politics or former bondage only when he sensed understanding. A Mexican hand might share family ranching knowledge with pride among those who respected it, and withhold it from those who treated him as a side note. Identity is not just what a person is. It is what the world lets him safely reveal. That makes the cowboy camp a fascinating social stage. Around the fire, the same tin cups pass from hand to hand, the same dust settles on every boot, and the same herd demands the next day's labour. Yet inside that sameness lie very different life paths. One man came west to escape debt, another to escape memory, another because he knew horses from childhood, another because the railroad dropped him off near opportunity and he followed it. The camp looks uniform at night. By daylight, history is sitting in every saddle in a different shape. There are quirky exceptions too, because any real workforce produces them. Some cowboys were educated far beyond what their surroundings suggested. Some had read more poetry than their boots implied. Some spoke multiple languages and pretended otherwise. Some were the sons of small landowners trying out a rougher life before returning home. Some were terrible riders who somehow remained employed through luck, optimism, and the mysterious mercy of employers. Every trade produces a few miracles of incompetence, the flattening of cowboy identity into one white, solitary, endlessly self-contained figure happened for reasons of culture and commerce. Dime novels, Wild West shows, films, and later television preferred a cleaner symbol. Symbols sell better when they are simplified. A diverse labour force with layered social histories is historically rich, but less convenient for myth-making than one stoic hero, outlined against the sunset. So the real mixture of the range faded behind a tidier fiction, but the truth remains more interesting. The cowboy world was built by many kinds of people. Black men seeking wages and movement in a hostile society, vaqueros and tejanos carrying deep traditions of cattle handling, white riders from farm country, war, or drift. Indigenous workers navigating transformed landscapes, immigrants fitting themselves into a rough labour economy, women sustaining ranch worlds even when the title cowboy did not belong to them, young hands learning, older hands enduring. The range was not one story, it was a braided one, and when you picture a camp at dusk or a trail line moving across the grass, that is what belongs there, not a single repeated face, but a working crowd shaped by many histories at once. Dust on every hat. Yes, tiredness in every back, certainly, but also different languages, different memories, different hopes folded into one difficult occupation. That is how the West really breathes. Not as a lone figure in perfect silhouette, but as a chorus of riders, each carrying a separate world into the saddle. Every cowboy town advertises freedom before it presents consequences. You see it first in the distance, rising from the plain as a low scatter of roofs, false fronts, hitching rails, wagon tracks, and dust. After weeks of grass, herd smell, and practical silence, a town looks almost theatrical. Boards standing upright with confidence, signs painted in bold letters, windows catching the sun, a church steeple, perhaps a hotel if fortune has blessed the place with ambition. Saloons always seem to find a way. Towns on the cattle routes, especially the lively railheads, offered something that felt nearly magical to a trail crew. Choice. And choice can be dangerous. Your horse feels the change before you do. The animal smells unfamiliar things on the wind. Coal smoke, cooked food, beer, manure from too many animals in one place, soap, perfume, stable hay, tobacco. Human density itself has a scent, thick and layered, so different from the open range that it almost seems artificial. Wheels rattle over hard ground. Someone shouts from a storefront. A hammer rings from a smithy. Piano music escapes through a saloon door in bright, slightly wounded notes. Dogs bark. Men laugh too loudly. The whole place buzzes with the energy of money trying to become memory. A cattle town is not merely a stop. It is a release valve. After long days of controlled labour, routine meals, and discipline around animals, town life offers the opposite. Noise instead of distance. Crowds instead of horizons. Mirrors, lamps, music, cards, barber chairs, whiskey bottles, fresh bread, hotel sheets, storefront goods, women in clean dresses, newspapers, polished boots in windows, and the immediate possibility of doing something unwise with complete enthusiasm. The cowboy arrives dusty, tired, underpaid, and ready to feel human in a way that has nothing to do with cattle. One of the first luxuries may be a bath, if such a thing is available and affordable. A proper wash after trail life feels almost suspiciously civilized. Soap on skin. Hot water if the town is unusually generous. A towel not yet ruined by camp use. The dirt comes away in grey streaks that suggest you may have been composed mostly of dust all along. Then there is the barber, a shave, a trim, hair flattened back into some agreement with society. To sit still in a chair while someone else improves your condition can feel oddly emotional after weeks of self-maintenance and hard weather. Then comes clothing, or at least the dream of it. A cowboy in town may buy a shirt brighter than practicality would advise, a neckerchief with some ambition, better boots, gloves, tobacco, or a new hat if the wages and ego align. Storefronts tempt the eye precisely because the range offers so little variety in objects. A polished pocket knife, a silver watch chain, suspenders, canned peaches, candy, a proper comb, a small bottle of scent, a deck of cards, a tin mirror. Even writing paper can seem charged with wonder. Consumer desire is not new. It merely looks more dramatic when dust has been your main accessory for a month, but no part of town exerts a stronger pull than the saloon. Swing doors, a lamp glow, a laughter, tobacco smoke, spilled beer, piano music working overtime, and the unmistakable scent of alcohol mixed with sawdust and sweat. It is less elegant than later paintings suggest and more crowded. Glasses clink, boots thump. Someone calls for another round. Someone else is already regretting the previous one with admirable speed. Mirrors behind the bar multiply the light, making the room feel fuller, brighter, busier. After the broad emptiness of the trail, such an interior can feel almost overwhelming. You step inside and the world closes warmly around you. Drink offers quick relief from fatigue, restraint, and memory. It also offers stupidity at scale. Many cowboys drank hard when they had the chance, though not all, and not all in the same way. A few may have kept discipline, plenty did not. A month or more of wages, boredom, soreness, and pent-up appetite could flow across a bar in a very short evening. Whiskey was common, sometimes rough enough to feel medicinal in the least comforting sense. Beer might be available, so might stronger mixtures of doubtful origin and ambitious effect. The range taught endurance, town-tested judgment. Card tables wait nearby. Gambling in cattle towns was both entertainment and hazard, which is simply another way of saying it was very popular. Faro, poker, monte, dice, and other games drew men eager to turn wages into either triumph or personal instruction. Lamps burned over green felt. Fingers tapped cards. Chips clicked. Eyes narrowed. A man who had spent weeks guiding longhorns with excellent patience might lose all inner balance before 3 kings and 1 bad decision. Luck has a way of looking philosophical until it empties your pocket. Yet town life is not all vice, whatever moralists later preferred to say. Cowboys also sought ordinary comforts. A decent meal eaten from proper plates. Beefsteak, pies, bread not cooked in camp, vegetables when available, coffee that had not boiled to death in a blackened pot, a bed in a hotel or boarding house, a chance to send or receive letters, a visit to a general store, a conversation with people not shaped by the same trail dust. Some men attended church if the timing worked and conscience remembered its duties. Others walked the streets simply to look, because looking itself was a pleasure after so much sameness of horizon. Music changes in town too, on the range. It is often one voice, perhaps a harmonica, perhaps a half-remembered tune. In town, the piano takes command. Fiddles may join. Singing turns bolder. Dance halls fill with rhythm and movement. Boots strike the floorboards. Skirts turn. Laughter rises with the music and with the smell of lamp oil, perfume, pomade, smoke, and whiskey. For a cowboy used to measured steps round campfires and sleeping herds, such scenes can feel intoxicating before the drinking even begins. Women in cattle towns occupied varied and often difficult positions. Some ran boarding houses, laundries, restaurants, or shops. Some performed music or danced in halls. Some worked in prostitution, an occupation deeply tied to boomtown economies and equally tied to danger, stigma, and exploitation. Popular tales often reduce women in western towns to decorative roles or moral warnings, but real lives were more complicated and harder than either picture. A cowboy entering town might encounter flirtation, kindness, business calculation, loneliness, performance, manipulation, or genuine companionship, sometimes all in the span of one evening. The town also provides law, or something attempting to resemble it. Marshals, sheriffs, constables, local ordinances, and the occasional posted notice remind you that settlements are built on rules, even if those rules wobble after midnight. Some rail towns imposed restrictions on carrying firearms within town limits, especially after repeated outbreaks of drunken conflict. Exactly how well such rules worked varied widely, but the idea itself tells you something important. The classic image of every man walking fully armed into every saloon without challenge is exaggerated. Frontier towns often wanted commerce more than chaos. and gunfire was bad for windows as well as public confidence, historians still argue over just how violent cattle towns truly were compared with their legends. Some places did see shootings, fights, theft, and considerable disorder, yet memory, newspapers, and entertainment often magnified these events into a constant atmosphere of lawless melodrama. Real towns contained plenty of waiting, buying, talking, eating, bargaining, sleeping, and regretting. Violence happened, but ordinary human traffic filled far more hours than revolvers did. This may disappoint the myth, but it improves the history. That said, fights were hardly unknown. Tension travelled easily where alcohol, exhaustion, gambling, wounded pride, and too many young men met in close rooms. A spilled drink could become an insult. A card game could become an accusation. A glance in the wrong direction at the wrong person could become a lesson in swelling. Cowboy disputes were not always noble contests of honour. Sometimes they were simply poor decisions wearing hats. Fists were common enough, knives less welcome. Guns raised the stakes from foolish to final with alarming speed, which is precisely why some towns tried to control them. The town also exposes the cowboy to how others see him. Children stare, merchants assess his purse, women may read his mood and means with trained accuracy. Townspeople may welcome the business while privately dreading the rowdiness cattle crews can bring. The cowboy becomes both customer and problem, admired for colour and resented for noise. This double status fits the occupation rather well. He arrives carrying money earned elsewhere and spends it in a blur, boosting the local economy while testing its patience. There are quirky details that do not often make the grand narrative. Cowboys buying hair tonic with absurd seriousness. Men spending hard-earned cash on candy. Riders who got sentimental over photography studios and posed stiffly in their best clothes, trying to send home proof that they had become something impressive. Boots polished like mirrors for exactly one evening. A new collar worn over a neck still marked by sun and sweat. There is tenderness in these little efforts. Even rough men want to look at themselves sometimes, and see possibility rather than fatigue. For some cowboys, town also means church bells, newspapers, and rumour, news of elections, strikes, wars, weather disasters, market prices, marriages, deaths, and railroad expansion comes through the printed page or through conversation leaning over counters. A man who has spent weeks in the saddle may suddenly discover the wider world has continued without consulting him. There is always something unsettling in that. You have been fighting mud, cattle, and sleep deprivation. While somewhere else people were debating tariffs and attending picnics, the barbershop is another small centre of social life. Chairs, mirrors, mugs, razors, the clean scent of soap, bay rum, hair tonic, and wet towels. Men gather to talk while waiting their turn, and the room becomes part grooming station, part news exchange, part temporary refuge from rougher entertainments. A shave can feel so luxurious that it borders on spiritual repair. Few things remind a working man of civilization more effectively than warm lather and someone else handling a blade with professional confidence. A cowboy may also spend part of town time in quieter ways, writing a letter by lamplight, sitting on a porch with coffee, watching wagons pass, sleeping half a day in a bed soft enough to feel vaguely immoral, walking alone at dawn when the streets are still cool and yesterday's noise has not yet returned. In those hours, towns show another face. Buckets splash, shopkeepers sweep boardwalks, bakery smells drift out into the morning, horses stamp near hitching rails, the air carries sawdust, fresh bread, damp wood, and the faint ghost of last night's spilled whiskey. Sooner or later, though, the temptations of town reveal their bill. Money gone, head aching, pride dented, a fight remembered with selective clarity, a card loss that still feels mathematically offensive, boots more expensive than necessary, a promise made unwisely, a hangover that seems determined to educate every bone in your skull. Freedom has a receipt, and towns are very efficient at presenting it. Many cowboys left with lighter pockets, mixed memories, and a renewed appreciation for the brutal honesty of the range. That is the paradox. Town represents escape from hardship, yet it creates fresh kinds of trouble. The open country asks for endurance, the settlement asks for restraint. One tests the body, the other tests appetite. On the trail, your enemy may be weather or cattle. In town, it may be vanity, loneliness, whiskey, boredom, or the old human hunger to feel briefly larger than your actual means. And still, when the next chance comes, many riders head back gladly, because towns offered flashes of colour and comfort that the range could never provide. Music under lamplight, a mirror that reflects a cleaner face, pie on a plate, fresh sheets, a barber's razor, a letter from home, laughter that is not shaped by fatigue, the possibility of being seen not just as labour, but as a man in a crowd, however briefly. So you ride in dusty and leave altered, whether by pleasure, expense, or regret. The boardwalks creak under your boots, the piano keeps going, glasses flash in the lamplight. Somewhere behind a storefront, someone is frying onions or baking bread. Somewhere at a card table, a cowboy is learning a very expensive lesson with great sincerity. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, the frontier reveals one of its quieter truths. Freedom is rarely simple. It usually comes with a tab. The cowboy legend teaches you to look for hardness first. A hard stare, a hard jaw, a hard ride into a hard sunset, with perhaps a hard remark delivered to someone who deserves it in a very photogenic way. Popular memory likes its men carved from certainty, but real cowboy life was rarely built from permanent displays of roughness. Out on the range, manners mattered, patience mattered, self-control mattered. Cooperation mattered more than any single man's dramatic pose. If you spent all day proving how fierce you were, the cattle would remain unimpressed and your crew would quickly grow tired of you. The truth is less theatrical and more interesting. A working cowboy needed toughness. Certainly, you could not do the job without endurance, nerve, and a willingness to accept discomfort as part of the furniture of life. But toughness in this world was usually practical rather than decorative. It showed in long hours, reliable work, and calm decisions under pressure. A loud man might look impressive in town. On the range, he often looked exhausting. The cowboy most worth trusting was not always the boldest or most talkative. Often he was the one who conserved words, watched carefully, and handled his share without fuss. That is one reason the real code of behaviour on the range could seem strangely restrained. You do not shout at cattle unless necessary. You do not rile horses for your own entertainment. You do not waste a crew's energy on vanity, if the day is already difficult enough. Courtesy, even in rough form, helps a camp function. A man who borrows a tool should return it. A rider who opens a gate should think about who must close it. A hand who finishes coffee should know whether there is more water. These are small things, but life in hard conditions depends on small things being done without speeches. The manners of the cowboy world were not polished like a parlour's, but they were real. Hat tipping, respectful greetings, measured introductions, a kind of dry hospitality to travellers or strangers who behaved themselves. A man might be judged first by how he rode, then by how he conducted himself once riding was done. Nobody needed lace cuffs or silver calling cards to understand the difference between steady and foolish. Good manners on the range often meant not creating extra work or irritation for others. This is a very solid definition of civilization, even if it smells faintly of horse. Masculinity in the cattle world also had a quieter side than later myths admitted. Men lived close to one another, depended on one another, and spent long stretches away from family life, privacy, and settled domestic order. They developed forms of friendship and emotional reliance that popular retellings often flatten into pure stoicism. A cowboy might rarely deliver a grand confession, yet still show care through practical acts, sharing tobacco, saving a hotter portion of supper, taking an unpleasant shift, helping patch gear, looking after a sick horse for a rider too tired to stand straight. Concern often came disguised as routine. This matters because myth likes the solitary figure. Real work prefers a crew. Even the most skilled rider depends on others during a drive, a roundup or a hard season on a ranch. Cattle are too many, weather too changeable, horses too unpredictable, and sleep too limited for isolated heroics to solve every problem. Teamwork is not sentimental, it is necessary. One man watches the herd while another sleeps. One circles wide to head off strays while another holds the line. One brews the coffee. One manages the remuda. One gives a quiet warning when the sky looks wrong. The whole system rests on cooperation so ordinary it often goes unnoticed. You see it in speech as well. Cowboy talk could be sparse, but sparseness is not the same as emotional emptiness. Men teased one another mercilessly, yes, but teasing itself often marked acceptance. Dry humour softened rough conditions and allowed feeling to move sideways where direct confession might feel awkward. A man who had a bad night might be mocked for his snoring, his horse, or his face at breakfast, yet still be quietly covered by the crew if he needed help. Affection sometimes arrived wearing sarcasm and dirty boots. Historians continue to debate how much the cowboy ideal shaped broader American masculinity, and how much later culture projected its own desires onto the cowboy. There is no question that the figure became a symbol of independence, nerve, and self-command. But the historical record suggests a more layered model. Real cowboys often needed patience more than aggression, emotional steadiness more than swagger, and social reliability more than lone defiance. They were not antisocial wanderers by nature. Many were disciplined workers in cooperative systems, even when those systems left room for individual pride. Patience may be the least celebrated cowboy virtue, which is a shame because it may be the most important. You wait on cattle, you wait on weather, you wait on a horse learning a task, you wait through dull miles, slow crossings, delayed pay, poor coffee, sore muscles, and the endless human talent for making simple jobs more complicated. To endure such waiting without becoming impossible to live with is a serious achievement. The cowboy myth prefers action. Cowboy life contains a great deal of controlled waiting interrupted by work. There were codes around conflict too. Men did fight. Of course they did. Fatigue, drink, money, pride, and cramped conditions can push almost any workforce toward bad decisions. But there was often a practical limit to tolerated foolishness. A man who picked trouble constantly became a liability. A crew could not function well if every slight turned into a scene. On the range, unnecessary drama is not rugged. It is inefficient. That is perhaps the least glamorous and most useful truth in the whole mythology. Personal appearance also carried more nuance than people assume. Clothes were functional, but they could still express taste, pride, or identity. A clean bandana, a carefully shaped hat, polished boots in town, silver on a saddle if a man could afford it, braided rawhide work, a favourite shirt worn on better days. Masculinity did not mean indifference to appearance. It meant knowing when and where appearance mattered. On the trail, utility ruled. In town, style could step in. A cowboy might spend most of his month smelling like camp smoke and horse, then suddenly care very much about a collar, a vest, or the angle of his hat brim. Men have always been more decorative than they admit. The body itself became part of cowboy manners. How you sat a horse, how you moved through a gate, how you handled a rope, how you carried your tiredness. Competence had a visible rhythm to it. A seasoned hand often moved with less wasted effort, less noise, less clatter. There is a kind of masculine grace in that, though it is rarely described as such. Not softness, not show, just economy. The body learns what matters and stops performing the rest. There were quirky beliefs attached to masculine reputation as well. Some riders were convinced a truly capable man never complained about weather, which is absurd because weather practically invites complaint. Others judged character by horse care, boot condition, or willingness to eat dreadful food without commentary. A few old-timers seem to measure worth by a man's relationship with coffee, as though moral fibre and burnt grounds were permanently linked. Work cultures always develop these strange private tests. They may not make sense from outside, but inside the group they feel nearly sacred. The cowboy myth also downplayed tenderness because tenderness is awkward for legend makers, yet daily life among animals demands gentleness of a practical kind. A horse with a sore back must be handled carefully. A calf may need delicate treatment. An injured hand must sometimes be washed and wrapped by another man. Night herding often required singing softly to settle cattle. Think about that for a moment. one of the most celebrated symbols of rough masculinity in American culture, spent part of his real working life murmuring lullabies into darkness so anxious animals would stay calm. History can be wonderfully impolite to stereotypes. Men on the range also carried homesickness, grief, fear, and memory, though not always in openly named form. Letters mattered. Songs mattered. Tiny possessions mattered. A photograph tucked away. A Bible. A pocket knife from a brother. A handkerchief. A charm. Perhaps. Though a man might deny it was a charm if asked directly. Emotional life travelled with them in objects because objects ask fewer questions than people do. Silence, in that sense, was not emptiness. It was storage. Some cowboys were more expressive than the myth allows. There were storytellers, singers, men who could quote poems or scripture, men sentimental about horses, weather, or mothers, men who became eloquent after supper or after a little whiskey. Others held themselves tighter. The range made room for several forms of masculinity so long as the work got done. What the job punished was not softness itself, but unreliability. A gentle man who worked hard could be respected. A swaggering man who failed his tasks could become a joke. This is another place where culture later simplified reality. Dime novels, stage shows, and films rewarded the image of the self-contained hard man who rarely needed anyone and revealed almost nothing. It is a useful dramatic device. It is not a full social portrait. The historical cowboy lived in a web of obligations, habits, and human dependencies. He needed cooks, wranglers, bosses, other riders, good horses, storekeepers, blacksmiths, and sometimes the very community he pretended not to need. Independence existed, but it was always partial. There is scholarly uncertainty about how consciously cowboys themselves thought in terms of a code. Some later memoirs and cultural retellings present a fairly defined ethic of honesty, courage, and loyalty. Historians question how formal this was in daily life versus how much it was organised later into something like a creed. Working men rarely stop between chores to write themselves a philosophy, yet their routines reveal values anyway. Keep your word if you can. Do your share. Do not panic. Respect skill. Care for your horse. Avoid needless noise. Help when it matters. Mock gently, not cruelly. Try not to become a burden. That is already a code, whether or not anyone stitched it onto a banner. The environment encouraged humility too. However competent you were, the sky remained larger, storms stronger, rivers colder, and cattle more numerous than your personal pride. Such conditions tend to wear the edges off theatrical ego, or at least they should. A man could boast in town, but on the range the land itself kept correcting people. The horse throws you, the rope tangles, the herd ignores your grand intentions. Humility may arrive with dust in its teeth, but it arrives. And then there is the matter of solitude. Cowboys are often imagined as solitary by nature, but much of their day was socially dense. You rode among others, ate among others, slept near others, worked in coordinated patterns, and spent long hours reading the moods of men as well as animals. True solitude came in brief moments. A turn at night watch, a ride to check a distant line, a pause at water. Those moments mattered because they were rare. They let a man think, pray, brood, or simply breathe without the friction of camp around him. Solitude was precious partly because life was so communal. By evening, when the fire drops low and the talk grows softer, the real shape of cowboy masculinity becomes easier to see. Not a carved statue of hardness, but a practical blend of endurance, restraint, humour, skill, and interdependence. A man may look stern and still save the best biscuit for someone sick. He may speak little and still keep a careful eye on a younger rider. He may complain about everyone in camp and then ride through cold rain to help them anyway. Human beings are not tidy, and working men least of all. That complexity is worth keeping, because once you strip away the performance, what remains is far more human than the myth. A cowboy was expected to be capable, yes, but also useful, strong, but not reckless, proud, but not impossible, calm under strain, patient with animals, reliable with men, quietly attached to habits of care that popular culture later called softness, only because it had forgotten how real life works. The hat, the horse, the open sky, all of that remains. But beneath it you find something better than stereotype. A hard life teaching measured manners. A rough world rewarding gentleness in disguise. A form of manhood less loud than legend, and stronger for it. At some point the wide open world begins to close, not all at once. That would be too tidy for history. No trumpet sounds over the plains. No grand voice announces that one age is ending and another has quietly arrived with wire, timetables, contracts and ledgers. Instead, change comes the way weather often comes on the range. First as a detail, then as a pattern, then as a fact too large to ignore. A fence post here, a rail line there, a pasture divided, a trail shortened, a town grown bigger, a ranch run more like a business and less like a gamble with hooves. For the cowboy, this means the work begins to feel different even when it still looks familiar. The horse is still there, the cattle are still there, the sky remains extravagantly wide, but the conditions shaping the job have shifted beneath everything. One of the clearest signs is barbed wire. It does not look like much at first glance. Just twisted strands of metal with sharp barbs set at intervals, stretched between posts over miles of country. Yet that thin line changes the social meaning of land. Where open range had once allowed cattle to move across vast unfenced spaces, barbed wire turns movement into permission. Land becomes more tightly claimed, more visibly divided, more aggressively defended. A cowboy riding through country cut by wire feels the difference in the body as much as in the mind. The horizon may still be broad, but the choices under it are fewer. Wire also alters the work itself. Driving cattle across long distances becomes more complicated when routes are blocked or narrowed. Roundups change, grazing patterns change, conflicts flare between ranchers, farmers, and large cattle interests over access, water, and boundaries. A horseman who once read open land now has to read ownership more carefully. The smell of sun-baked grass and dust remains the same, but the social texture of the landscape has changed. The prairie is no longer only a place of movement. It is becoming a map of claims. Railroads tighten the change even further. In the great years of the long trail drives, cattle had to be moved overland to distant railheads. That long movement shaped much of the classic cowboy image. But as rail lines spread deeper into cattle country, the need for vast drives often diminished. Why push herds for months if rail transport can meet them closer to where they are raised? Steel tracks, telegraph lines, depots, schedules, market reports, and freight cars all begin to fold the West into a fast-assist, more organized economy. The cowboy still works, but he works in a world with less romance available to chance. You can hear this new world differently. Alongside wind in the grass and cattle lowing comes the whistle of locomotives in the distance. Iron wheels rattle over rails, hammers strike spikes. Telegraph offices hum with messages that travel faster than any horse could dream. A ranch owner can learn market news sooner. A buyer can plan more precisely. Distance, which once shaped the whole rhythm of cattle life, starts to shrink under industrial logic. For the cowboy, that means one of the old measures of the job, long movement across open ground, begins to lose its hold. Winter helps end the old order too. The brutal winter of 1886 and 1887 became legendary for a reason. In many northern cattle regions, extreme cold, deep snow, and deadly conditions wiped out enormous numbers of livestock. Cattle weakened by overgrazing, poor planning, and exposure simply did not survive. The image of endless abundance on the range met the hard mathematics of weather and lost badly. After such disasters, many ranchers rethought their methods. More fencing, more controlled breeding, more hay production, more settled ranch management, less faith in the old free-range system that had seemed so expansive and profitable in gentler years. This is one of history's little ironies. The cowboy legend often celebrates the mastery of nature, but the transition out of the classic range era was pushed along by nature's refusal to be mastered. A terrible winter can teach more economic theory than 100 speeches. Frozen carcasses across a field are a harsh form of bookkeeping. The lesson is unpleasant but effective. Risk must be managed. Land must be controlled. Systems must change. And with that, the cowboy moves further from the drifting trail figure and closer to the life of a ranch employee inside a more organized business. Large ranches become more bureaucratic in tone, not always in the modern office sense, though heaven knows some men would have preferred a stampeding herd to paperwork. But records matter more. Breeding choices matter more. Fences must be maintained. Water sources managed. Hay put up for winter. Stock counted with greater care. Owners think in terms of efficiency, output, and property in ways that narrow the old improvisational freedom of open country. A cowboy still rides. He still mends, sorts brands, and watches stock. Yet the work belongs increasingly to a settled system rather than to a moving frontier. This changes the emotional feel of the occupation as well. The classic trail cowboy lived inside motion. Camp today, river tomorrow, town next week, market after that. Even the monotony had movement in it. The later ranch cowboy may know the same land more intimately, but in a more confined way. Fences define routes. Responsibilities repeat within clearer bounds. There is perhaps more stability, maybe even more regularity, but less of the drifting grandeur that later myth would make famous. The life grows narrower as it grows more secure, which is a very common bargain in human history. Not everyone mourns that bargain equally. Some men prefer settled ranch work, better shelter perhaps, more regular conditions, less of the soul-eroding uncertainty of the long trail, more chances to build relationships, families, routines, and reputations in one place. Others feel the loss sharply. The open range had offered a kind of rough liberty, even when it also offered low wages and hard sleeping. To see that world tightened by wire and schedule can feel like watching a door close, especially for men who had built their identity around space and movement. There is scholarly disagreement about how sudden or complete this ending really was. Historians are careful here, and wisely so. The cowboy did not vanish in a single dramatic moment. Long drives continued in some form for a time. Open range persisted longer in some regions than others. Ranch work remained vital. Rodeo culture emerged from working skills and preserved parts of the old craft in new public forms. The figure of the cowboy adapted, shifted, and survived. Yet the classic era of vast unfenced cattle movement undeniably narrowed. The legend began solidifying just as the original conditions were fading. That often happens. People start turning a working life into myth when they suspect it is slipping away. The cowboy becomes more visible in stories, even as his real economic world grows more constrained. Dime novels spread simplified images. Wild West shows stage the frontier for audiences eager to consume adventure at a safe distance. Later, film and television smooth the rough edges further, polishing the cowboy into symbol. He becomes cleaner, more solitary, more uniformly heroic, more white, more certain, and considerably less tired than the historical worker ever had time to be. The actual labourer who smelled of horse, leather, smoke, and sweat slowly gives way to an icon outlined against sunset. This is a strange kind of survival. The man fades. The image thrives. Meanwhile, actual ranch work keeps going in practical clothes. Cattle still need handling. Horses still need care. Fences break. Calves arrive. Water matters. Storms still punish carelessness. The daily reality remains stubborn, as daily realities usually do. Even while public imagination runs off with the costume and leaves the chores behind. Somewhere a cowboy is mending a gate while a city audience imagines heroic silence on a ridge. History can be unintentionally funny that way. There are quirky details in this transition too. Some older cowboys distrusted barbed wire with real passion, regarding it as unnatural, dangerous, and deeply insulting to both cattle and tradition. Horses disliked it too, often for sensible reasons involving skin. Fence cutting became a real problem in some regions where anger over land closure boiled into conflict. The very object that symbolized order to one person symbolized imprisonment to another. Few inventions have transformed a landscape so thoroughly while looking so unimpressive. Towns change as well. Rail connections strengthen them. Supply chains improve. Populations become less temporary in some places. The rough cattle town may begin to settle into something more domestic, commercial, and regulated. Families arrive in greater numbers, schools expand, churches solidify their presence, boardwalk noise gives way, gradually and unevenly, to a more structured civic life. For the cowboy, the social world shifts from boomtown spontaneity towards something closer to permanent community, whether he wanted that or not. And underneath it all, age works its own quiet change. A young cowboy may ride wire-lined pastures and still feel he has entered the old life, because youth is generous with imagination. An older hand feels the difference immediately. He notices the missing vastness, the lost routes, the fewer drives, the increased counting, planning, and confinement. He may not put it into elegant words. Working men often do not. But he senses that the occupation has tilted. The old rhythm is thinning. You can imagine one of these men at dusk, perhaps near a fence line that catches the last light in thin silver points. The air smells of dry grass, warm horse, and the faint rust of wire cooling after heat. Meadowlarks have gone quiet. Cattle move more slowly now inside visible boundaries. The rider rests a hand on the saddle horn and looks out over country that still appears immense, though he knows better. Immense is not the same as open. The difference matters. What fades, in the end, is not simply a job but a certain arrangement of life. Open range meant uncertainty, hardship, and exploitation. Yes, it also meant motion, improvisation, and a daily intimacy with distance that modern systems steadily reduce. The cowboy of legend grows larger precisely because the lived experience becomes harder to recover in full. Once barbed wire, railroads, severe winters, settled ranching, and modern markets reshape the West. The old trail life begins to feel almost dreamlike even to those who once endured it with sore backs and questionable coffee. Yet the cowboy remains powerful because he contains a contradiction people recognize deeply. He is a worker remembered as a hero, a wage hand turned into a symbol of freedom, a man shaped by routine, dependence, and labor transformed into an emblem of independence. That contradiction gives the figure unusual staying power. It lets generations project their own longings onto him. Escape, competence, silence, endurance, simplicity, self-command, connection to land, resistance to crowded modern life. Never mind that the real cowboy often wanted better pay, dry socks, and a less dramatic river crossing. Myths are rarely polite enough to preserve ordinary desires. Still, the truth deserves its place. The real cowboy life in 19th century America was hard, repetitive, skilled, diverse, underpaid, and physically exhausting. It required patience more than swagger, teamwork more than theatrical independence, and ordinary endurance more than constant danger. It carried beauty, certainly, but beauty mixed with dust, hunger, boredom, weather, and labour. As the old open-range world receded, what survived in memory was only part of the story. The fading itself has a certain melancholy, not because every part of the old life was good, much of it was not, but because any world built around a distinct rhythm of work, land, and habit leaves a feeling behind when it changes. You sense it in abandoned trail routes, in weathered corrals, in old bunkhouses smelling faintly of boards and time, in photographs where riders stare stiffly at the camera as if unsure whether posterity deserves their trouble. The cowboy's world did not vanish into nothing. It settled into other form, and into legend besides. Now the night draws in more softly. The horse beneath you is warm and steady. The cattle have grown quiet, their shapes dark against the dimming earth. A breeze moves through the grass with a dry whisper, carrying the scent of dust, sage, and evening. Somewhere far off, perhaps, comes the faintest suggestion of a train, small and lonely in the distance. Above it all, the sky opens wide and patient, full of stars that ignore fences, markets, owners, and stories alike. You let the scene grow calmer. The sharp edges of labour soften in the dark. The wire lines fade from sight. The noise of towns and railheads drifts away. The old trail, the ranch yard, the river crossing, the campfire, the quiet horse, all of it settles into one long breath of memory. You do not have to sort legend from truth any longer tonight. You can simply rest with the feeling of the land, the creak of leather, the cool air on tired skin, and the steady comfort of knowing that ordinary lives, even hard ones, leave deep tracks in history. The stars remain, the grass keeps moving, the cattle breathe in low, slow rhythms, and the cowboy, worker and myth at once, rides gently into the darkness where all old worlds finally go, not lost exactly, but softened, carried, and remembered.